long before any tree rose to claim the sky, long before any queen held up a ring and called it law. The universe had been spoken of as a single, seamless thing. Old accounts called it the One Great, not a kingdom, not a planet, not even a god in the way later ages understood gods, but an unbroken whole where separation had not yet learned to exist. And then came the fracture. It was not remembered as a battle with swords or a burning city, because there had been no cities to burn. It was remembered as the first great splitting, one vast unity becoming many, and in that act, the first true conditions of life were allowed to appear. Where there was once only oneness, there could now be distinct spirits, distinct selves, distinct hungers. The simple peace of being merged into everything gave way to the complicated ache of being someone. From that distant beginning, the greater will was described not as a warm presence, but as a far signal, like a star that did not speak in words, only in pressure, in direction, in gravity of intent. Later faiths would argue over whether that signal was benevolent or indifferent, whether it carried love or merely instruction. But in the earliest telling, what mattered was this: something reached toward the world, and the world tried to answer back. The first answer was not the Elden Beast, not yet. The first thing said to have arrived was Meter, mother of fingers, falling like a star that had chosen the earth as its altar. In the language of calm historians, she was a messenger, a living conduit, the earliest bridge between the distant will and the physical world. In the language of bedtime, she was a lonely, ancient mother who landed too hard, too far from home, and still tried to do her job anyway. She became the origin of the fingers, those strange interpreters that later ages treated like holy judges, two fingers that sat in cathedrals and spoke with twitching certainty, finger creepers that skittered in forgotten places like the nightmare echo of a divine limb. All of them, in their different shapes, traced back to Mater's body and Mater's purpose, to receive what the greater will sent and translate it into guidance the world could follow. But the quiet horror of the beginning was this: Mater did not remain whole. Some accounts suggested she was damaged at her arrival, wounded by the impact of descending into a world that could not properly receive her. Other records implied some older catastrophe, some unseen violence in the deep past. The details were blurred, like a memory sewn through water, yet the result remained. Metyr was harmed, and in being harmed, she was changed. The change was not merely physical. Something in her connection failed. The mother endured, and she continued to birth the fingers, because mothers often do continue, even when something essential has gone missing. The children kept emerging, generation after generation, stretching their pale joints and reaching outward for instruction. But the distant signal had become faint, or absent, or perhaps it had never been as clear as the children believed. And so a terrible possibility entered the world like a cold draft under a door. The fingers might not have been speaking for the greater will at all, at least not anymore. They might have been interpreting nothing, or worse, interpreting the warped echoes of a wounded parent's confusion. What later kingdoms called guidance could have been a performance staged in the dark, a ritual of meaning made to comfort the interpreters themselves. It was difficult for later ages to accept. People wanted their laws to come from something clean and unquestionable, They wanted a straight line from heaven to throne, command, then obedience, then salvation. And so the official histories, the bright histories, rarely lingered on Mater's damage. They preferred an image of flawless transmission, 2 fingers, as perfect mouthpieces, their gestures as pure as scripture. But the realm of shadow, where truths were buried, preserved a different kind of memory. It held the implication that the chain had been cracked at its first link. If Metir had been broken long before the rise of Marika, then the entire architecture of sacred legitimacy became uncertain. Empyreans, those chosen vessels who were said to be selected by the fingers, might have been selected by an institution that no longer heard the voice it claimed to represent. The calling that shaped destinies might have been misread, mistranslated, or quietly invented to fill the silence. In that light, the world's later tragedies took on a sadder texture. Not only wars of ambition, but wars of interpretation. Not only cruelty, but cruelty carried out under banners that believed themselves commanded by something higher. And this uncertainty did not make the world less religious. It made it more desperate. A broken oracle does not stop people from asking questions. It only ensures that the answers become more dangerous, because the ones who speak them must speak with absolute confidence to hide their doubt. The fingers, twitching and sure, could become the perfect engine of certainty, declaring destinies with no way for anyone to verify the source. Their declarations could be echoed by priests, enforced by knights, written into laws, and used to justify the erasure of entire peoples. In the warm hush of later gold, people would say the greater will had guided everything, that it had shaped history the way a gardener shapes a tree. But the older, darker possibility suggested something else, that history had been shaped by an anxious interpretation of distant, broken signals, by creatures trying to give meaning to silence, and by rulers eager to call that meaning divine. And so, in the very earliest age, before dragons crowned storm peaks, before horned towers rose in spirals, before jars swallowed the living, before red fire painted cities into ash, the seed of theological shock was already planted. The world had a messenger, but the messenger was wounded. The world had interpreters, but the interpreters might have been guessing. And once a world builds its whole sense of righteousness on guidance that cannot be proven, it becomes frighteningly easy to call violence order, to call conquest destiny, and to call a buried shame holy necessity. Far later, when gold rose bright enough to blind, shadow would rise with it, not as a separate invention, but as the unavoidable consequence of refusing to look at what came before. Yet even now, in this first quiet turning of the page, the realm of shadow could be felt in embryo, not yet a place behind a veil, but a habit of concealment, an instinct to hide fractures, to smooth over breaks, to insist that the message was perfect even when the receiver was failing. Meta remained alone in her ancient place, still birthing the shapes that would one day sit in judgment of the world. And in the silence between her and the distant stars, a question began to breathe, softly at first, like a sleeper shifting in bed. If the guidance was broken, who then had truly been steering the ages? The question did not have an answer that could be held in the hand. In the oldest places, beneath ruined altars, behind sealed doors where even torchlight seemed to thin, there were signs that the world itself had tried to cope with that uncertainty, not with clarity, but with repetition, not with proof, but with ceremony. Meteor's children had been made to interpret, and so they interpreted everything. The drift of ash on windless nights, the pattern of cracks in stone, the way certain flowers refused to grow near certain waters. The more the true signal faded, the more the interpreters had relied on habit. Gesture became scripture. Twitch became doctrine. Silence became a space that had to be filled, because a filled silence felt less frightening than an honest one. And around that filling silence, early faith had gathered like moss. There were those who insisted the greater will still spoke clearly, that any doubt was blasphemy. There were those who quietly suspected the opposite, but could not say it aloud, not because they feared punishment, though punishment would come, but because they feared the void that followed the idea. If the guidance was broken, then the world was not a story being narrated from above. It was a story being written in real time by frightened, ambitious beings. Even so, Meteor remained the first great hinge of belief, the mother of fingers, a presence both sacred and unsettling. In some accounts, she was described in reverent terms, as though to name her properly was to keep the world aligned. In others, she was described with a kind of careful dread, because her form and her purpose did not fit neatly into later, comforting ideas of divinity. She was not a gentle god of harvests or a radiant spirit of mercy. She was a conduit, an organ meant to receive, translate, and command. And conduits did not get to choose what they carried. So the realm of shadow's earliest theological wound was not simply that the message might have been misread. It was that the world had been built upon that reading anyway. The great institutions that would later claim absolute authority, the ones that would pronounce blessings, condemn heresies, select heirs of godhood, had grown from an origin that might have already been compromised. In quieter language, it meant this: the world's holiest certainty could have been, from the start, a kind of beautiful mistake. Some old records spoke of Mater's damage as a thing that could be seen, not just inferred, a fault that made her children strange, too many fingers in the wrong places, too much crawling life where there should have been solemn stillness. Those signs were not always treated as warnings. Often they were treated as proofs of mystery, and mystery has always been the easiest thing to worship when truth feels too sharp. So pilgrims came, priests came, and later, when power learned how useful faith could be, rulers came too. They did what people always did when faced with an incomprehensible relic. They built around it. They framed it. They elevated it. They turned it into a center. And soon the center began to speak. It was easy in those early ages for the fingers to become a kind of unquestioned oracle. If they were the only interpreters anyone had, then their words did not need to be proven. They only needed to be repeated. And every repetition made the words feel older and therefore truer. But the realm of shadow remembered what the bright histories tried to smooth over. It remembered the way the earliest teachings carried tiny contradictions, like hairline cracks in porcelain. It remembered that even the most fervent records sometimes admitted in a careful aside that the guidance could be vague, or delayed, or strangely inconsistent. It remembered that sometimes the interpreters offered answers that seemed less like revelations and more like reactions, rules shaped by fear, by preference, by desperation to maintain authority. It was not that the greater will did not exist, or that it had never reached toward the world. The older stories did not make that claim. What they implied instead was more unsettling, that the world might have been living with a damaged relay, and no one wanted to admit it, because admitting it would mean admitting that the throne of heaven might be empty, or simply far away, too far to correct the errors made in its name. In time, that uncertainty began to express itself in the world's landscapes, as though belief could scar terrain. Sacred sites grew severe and quiet, places where sound died quickly, where even footsteps felt like an offense. The air around such places seemed to demand obedience, and in those places, the fingers, whether truly guided or not, were treated as the final authority. They selected, they blessed, they condemned, they reached their pale joints toward the future and told it what shape it must take. And so, before the Age of Dragons rose on storm wings, the world already had the beginnings of an institution that could make destiny feel official. A single pronouncement could become a reason to crown a ruler, to exile a rival, to sanctify a war. A single interpretation could become the seed of an entire theology, and because the source could not be verified, the interpretations could grow into anything. In the realm of Shadow's memory, this was the first quiet tragedy. The world did not collapse into chaos when the guidance became uncertain. It became more rigid. It became more hungry for order. The less certain the truth, the more violently people demanded certainty from each other. From that hunger came an early pattern that would repeat again and again across ages, especially in the veiled land that would one day be hidden away. A wound appeared. Someone tried to hide it. The hiding created a shadow, and the shadow grew heavy with everything that could not be spoken. Mater, damaged and enduring, remained at the heart of it. Not as a villain, not as a savior, just as a mother whose body had become a broken instrument, still producing children that tried to sing a song they could not fully hear. And somewhere beyond the world, the greater will remained distant, whether watching, indifferent, or simply too far to reach back in time and correct the first fracture of communication. The question returned, soft as a lullaby and just as persistent. If the guidance was broken, who then had truly been steering the ages? For a long time, the world answered that question the only way it knew how, with new powers, new crowns, new myths strong enough to drown doubt. And the first great myth that rose to blanket the uncertainty was not made of gold. It was made of storm. It was made of scales. It was made of an ancient throne perched on a wounded peak, where the sky itself seemed to remember being torn. That unanswered question lingered behind everything, like a faint ringing after a great bell had stopped moving. And as ages turned, the world's first towering answer took shape in the roar of wind and the crack of lightning over the jagged peak. In that era, the dragons held what looked, from a distance, like unquestionable authority, not because they claimed to interpret distant will, but because they were visibly, terrifyingly real. Their dominion was written in storm fronts, in blasted rock, in the way lesser creatures learned to lower their eyes when shadows passed overhead. The jagged peak was remembered as a throne that he'd been injured. Its slopes were not gentle. They looked torn open, as if the mountain had once fought the sky and lost. Lightning clung to it the way ivy clung to ruins, not as a brief weather, but as a permanent wound. And high above the trembling lands, there had been a sense that something old and proud sat within that storm, an order that did not need permission to exist. Placidusax reigned there in the language of legend, not merely a dragon, but a lordly presence tied to a time when the world's rules had not yet been rewritten by later gold. His seat was not a soft palace, but a place where the air itself seemed to coil and tense, where the horizon looked bruised. To speak his name in later centuries was to summon the feeling of ancient sovereignty, something that did not ask and did not explain. Yet even the age of dragons, for all its thunder, carried the same truth that would haunt every later age. Greatness was never as stable as it appeared. Cracks formed long before collapse. Betrayals happened long before the histories admitted them. Baal the Dread entered those old tales as a shadow within the storm, a rival, a threat, and then something worse than either, an intimate violence within the dragon order itself. The conflict between Placidusax and Baal was not remembered like a simple duel. It was remembered like a tearing, something that mutilated more than bodies. It damaged the feeling of permanence that the Dragon Age depended on. There were records, half hymn, half warning, that spoke of betrayal and its cost, of a lord harmed not only by an enemy, but by the fact that an enemy could reach him at all. In the quiet way bedtime stories sometimes describe painful things, it was said that the Dragon Order began to weaken long before the Erdtree's law rose bright enough to replace it. Not because a new power had already conquered it, but because it had begun to rot from within, pride turning into fracture, rivalry turning into ruin. The mountain storm did not stop, but storms could rage over empty thrones too. What remained after that violence was an age that still looked mighty from afar, yet carried a limp inside it. The dragons continued to be feared. Their breath still scarred stone. Their wings still turned daylight into brief eclipses. But somewhere in the world's deeper memory, the idea of unquestionable dragon order had already been wounded, mutilated by betrayal, diminished by the proof that even ancient lords could be reached, torn, and made to bleed power away into the wind. And this mattered, because later ages would pretend that the coming of gold was the first time an old order fell. The realm of shadow remembered otherwise. It remembered that the world had already practiced collapse once, high on the jagged peak, before any shining tree claimed to be eternal. The storm throne had been wounded, the dragon order had been weakened, and in that weakening, space opened for other civilizations to rise, civilizations that would reach for the Crucible's raw power in stranger ways, building towers not of storm, but of spiraling stone and sacred horn. The storms did not end. They simply learned a new patience. High above the veiled lowlands of the realm of shadow, Jagged Peak stood like a wound that never fully closed. Its ridgelines were broken teeth, its cliffs split into sheer seams of black rock, and its air carried the taste of old lightning, metallic, sharp, and faintly bitter, as though the sky itself had once been struck too many times and remembered it. The wind there did not merely blow. It pushed, it leaned, it worried at stone. Clouds snagged on the spires and tore apart into ribbons. And when thunder rolled, it sounded less like weather and more like a slow, ancient breath. exhaled from something immense that had once ruled the heights. In those earliest eras, long before the Erdtree's law was spoken like a prayer, and long before gold pretended it had always been the world's first language, the ancient dragons had held dominion over the skies. A jagged peak had served as a harsh throne for that dominion, a place where storms could be worn like crowns and where power was measured in endurance. The dragons were not simply large beasts. They were an order with rank and memory, with a kind of ritual majesty. Their scales were said to be like stone, their hearts like furnaces, and their lightning, bright, structured, almost sacred, fell in clean lines that split the air and left the world stunned into silence. At the center of that order waited Dragon Lord Placidusax, an Elden Lord of a prehistoric age, a sovereign whose rule carried the strange quiet of someone still listening for a god that no longer answered. He was remembered as many-headed, many-eyed, an authority that looked in several directions at once, as if the very idea of his reign was to watch the horizon for a return that never came. In the realm of shadow, that waiting took on a particular weight, because everything in that land seemed built around what was absent, missing guidance, missing truth, missing light. Even in that time, the peak felt like a place where power stood on the edge of abandonment. And then the betrayal came. Baal the Dread rose not as a noble heir within the ancient dragon order, but as something adjacent, connected by blood and storm, yet marked as lesser by the old hierarchy. He was a drake, not an ancient dragon, flesh where others bore the permanence of stone-like scale, raw muscle and living heat, where others carried an almost mineral serenity. Yet that lesser nature hid a savage advantage. Baal's strength was not refined into ceremony. It was primal. He carried fire and lightning in a wilder form, as if the crucible's older violence still churned close to the surface of his being. He did not strike like law. He struck like hunger. The peak became their arena. Storms gathered as though summoned by the insult of what was about to happen. Lightning threaded between the spires. The sky's color deepened into bruised reds and bruised violets, and the air shivered with pressure. To imagine that battle as a single moment would be a mistake. It lived in the mountain. It carved itself into the place. Even later ages would find the peak filled with the evidence of draconic wrath. Scarred rock, shattered ledges, paths that seemed bitten away by claws the size of wagons. Baal challenged Placidusax, and with that challenge, tore the veil from the Dragon Order's quiet weakness. For all their majesty, they had already begun to thin at the center. A lord who waited for a vanished god was a lord whose court could not fully settle. An order that depended on an external voice, divine or cosmic, could endure for a long time, but it could not remain unchanged. Baal did not create that weakness. He simply struck where it already existed. The clash between them was described in old accounts as mutilation on both sides, but even those words were too clean. Placidusax emerged from it diminished, missing multiple heads that had once been part of his terrible completeness. The absence of those heads was more than physical. It was symbolic, like a temple whose towers had been snapped off, leaving only the base and the memory of height. Yet Placidusax still endured, a broken lord who continued to exist in the posture of waiting, as if stubbornness itself could substitute for a god. Baal survived too, But survival did not mean victory without cost. He was left maimed, his wing torn, his leg lost, his body altered into a form that could no longer fly with the same freedom as before. And so, injured and furious, he retreated upward into the highest reaches of Jagged Peak, where the air was thin and the world below looked distant enough to hate properly. Afterward, the peak did not celebrate. It simply kept raining ash-colored dust and storm water down its gullies as if washing its hands. The Dragon Order, once held together by the illusion of permanence, began to unravel. Not in a single collapse, not with a banner falling and a trumpet sounding, but with the quiet reality that the center could be wounded and that a lesser dragon could bloody an Elden Lord and live. In that sense, the battle at Jagged Peak became a kind of prophecy for the realm of shadow itself. It showed what happened when systems built on assumed authority met something that refused to kneel. It showed how an ancient order could be old enough to seem eternal and still be fragile in the exact place it believed itself strongest. It also left behind a dangerous inheritance. Baal's continued existence, brooding at the summit, became a source point for later Drake lineages, modern offshoots that carried his bitterness like a seed, spreading it forward into ages that no longer remembered what had originally been stolen. The dread did not die, it reproduced. And below, in the space the dragons had once filled with certainty, the world began to hear other footsteps. Where once the sky had been ruled by stone scale and golden lightning, the empty places between storms started to invite new kinds of ambition. Civilizations that had watched from caves and cliffs, learning, measuring, resenting, found themselves standing under a less certain heavens. The peak remained, of course. The storms remained. Baal remained, like a grudge nailed into the summit. But the idea of a single draconic order, unchallenged and whole, had been broken. That brokenness mattered. It meant that when later powers rose, powers of tower and horn, powers of right and cruelty, powers that would call the crucible sacred in their own way, they did not rise beneath an unshakable sky empire. They rose into a vacancy. They rose into a world already proven capable of overthrowing its oldest masters. And so the realm of shadow, always a place that kept history like sediment, held the dragon era the way it held everything else, not as a triumphant beginning, but as the first clear sign that even the mightiest rains could bleed, fracture, and leave behind only storms and silence, storms above, silence below, and the slow, inevitable approach of the next people who would dare to build towers close enough to touch the sky. And so the vacancy above the world began to feel real. After the storm war at Jagged Peak, the Dragon Age did not end with a clean border between before and after. It thinned the way a long rain thinned into mist. The skies still carried the old thunder. Lightning still wrote brief, bright scars across the clouds. But the feeling of a single, unquestionable order, an age that could never be challenged, had been cracked. In the realm of Shadow's memory, that crack mattered more than any victory. It meant that the world had learned a lesson early. Even the most ancient throne could be contested. Even a lord crowned by storm could be brought low by betrayal. And once the world learned that, it never truly forgot. Jagged Peak remained harsh and sleepless. Its ridges kept the shape of struggle. Wind continued to scrape at stone as if it were trying to sand down history itself. Somewhere high within that hostile height, Baal endured, alive, wounded, and unyielding, less a ruler than a lingering consequence. The old records did not treat him as a triumphant founder of peace. They treated him as an open wound that refused to scab over, a reminder that rage could survive, even when an age's certainty did not. Placidusax, too, remained in the way old tragedies often remain, not gone, but diminished, an echo of a former completeness. The Dragon Order still had fearsome presence, still had shape and memory, but it no longer felt like the unquestioned axis of the world. The very fact that an internal war had happened at all, within the storm throne itself, made the age feel less like a divine design and more like a living thing that could falter. And that faltering created room, not immediately, not with banners snapping in new wind, but with the slow shift of attention. Creatures that had spent generations looking down and cowering began to look up. People who had once measured their lives by the passing shadow of wings began to imagine a life where the sky could be negotiated with, bargained with, even challenged. This was how the world prepared itself for towers. It was not only that dragons weakened, it was that the idea of permanence weakened. The world's faith in a single, natural hierarchy became less absolute, and when faith in hierarchy loosens, other structures rise to take its place, structures made by hands, by rites, by laws, by cruelty carefully dressed as sacred tradition. In later bright histories, the Dragon Age would be treated like a distant prologue, a prehistoric mural painted on the far wall of time. But the realm of shadow held it closer, because the realm of shadow cared less about which age was first, and more about which wounds repeated. The Dragon Age was the first time the world learned how a great order could be wounded from within, and how that wound could outlive the battle that made it. So the storms kept rolling over the peak, and below those storms, a different kind of ambition began to gather, quiet at first, then more confident, like stone foundations laid one block at a time. Where dragons had ruled by presence, the next civilization would rule by meaning. Where dragons had claimed the sky through sheer existence, the next civilization would claim it through ritual, through symbols that promised connection to powers older than any crown. And so, as the dragon era faded into lingering thunder, the valleys and highlands of the realm of shadow began to fill with a new shape, tall, spiraling architecture that looked less like shelter and more like reaching. In the long hush that followed the storm war, stone began to rise where wings had once ruled, and as the world's gaze drifted down from jagged peaks, bruised heavens, it found a civilization that did not fear heights. It worshipped them. They were remembered as the Tower Folk, and also as the Hornsent, and the double name suited them. Their identity was split between what they built and what they carried. Towers were their declaration to the world that they intended to stand upright beneath whatever remained of the storm that they intended to reach. Horns were their doctrine, a living sign of the crucible's power, and, so their faith insisted, an antenna of the body, a sacred instrument meant to connect flesh to divinity and to the raw, ancient energy that churned beneath all later laws. In their own telling, horns were not merely growths, they were proof that the crucible, the primal, tangled source of life's many forms, still breathed through them, proof that they were closer to the old truth than those who had smooth brows and quiet blood, proof that the world had once been wild and sacred, and that they, the horn-scent, carried that sacred wildness in their very bone. This belief shaped everything they did. It shaped their posture, their hierarchy, their art, even their cruelty. Their cultural and political heart was Belurat, a place that later ages would remember in broken fragments, ruined streets, half-swallowed stones, the feeling of an old city that had once been crowded with chanting and strict processions. Above it rose Enir Elim, the tower, tall enough to feel like a challenge, ancient enough to feel like a promise. Even when time gnawed at its edges, even when later violence scorched and shattered what could be shattered, the tower still carried the sense of an intention to rise toward the place where guidance should have been, to bridge the gap between earth and whatever listened. But the tower folk did not only build upward, they built inward, too, into systems of caste and enforcement, into institutions that turned spiritual difference into social law. Their society was rigidly divided, and it was not rigid by accident. It was rigid because they believed holiness could be measured, and that once measured, it could be ranked. Horns became signs not only of connection, but of status. The more blessed one appeared, the more authority one could claim. The less blessed one appeared, the more one was expected to kneel, serve, and accept the shape of a life chosen for them. Above the ordinary people stood a class of inquisitors, agents of religious authority who acted as judges, enforcers, and keepers of doctrine. In the tower folks' own language, they would have been described as guardians of sacred order, protectors of the community's purity. In the quieter, colder memory preserved by the realm of shadow, they were the hands that made sure the hierarchy stayed sharp. They watched, they corrected, they punished. And because their punishments were wrapped in ritual, the punished were often expected to call it mercy. This was how the horn-scent managed to become both radiant and tainted at the same time. Their civilization was undeniably powerful, organized, ambitious, steeped in a faith that gave it direction. Yet that same faith made them arrogant. They began to treat their own interpretation of holiness as the world's natural law. They began to believe that because they could reach upward with towers and horns, the rest of the world existed to support their reaching. Their greatest symbols were the divine beasts, holy manifestations that embodied the primal forces of nature. To the horn-scent, these beings were not mere animals or myths. They were living icons, storm and lightning given shape, the raw majesty of weather and wilderness pressed into sacred form. When the horn-scent spoke of the divine beasts, they spoke with reverence and fear, as if those beings were proof that the world still remembered its prehistoric soul. And yet, even here, the realm of shadow remembered the pattern. Reverence could become justification, fear could become control. The divine beasts represented the primal, untamed forces of the world, storms, thunder, nature's fierce and indifferent strength. But the horn-scent did not truly want an untamed world. They wanted to be the ones who named it sacred. They wanted to be the ones who decided who could approach the holy and who must be kept outside the gates. So their towers rose, and their rites deepened, and their caste lines hardened into something that felt permanent. They believed their civilization would last because it was built on the crucible's truth. They believed their horns made them chosen. They believed their inquisitions were necessary to preserve purity. They believed their cruelty was a sacred tool, an unpleasant medicine administered for the health of the whole. It is a gentle thing, in bedtime telling, to admit this. Civilizations rarely recognize the moment when confidence becomes arrogance. It happens gradually, like a room growing dim as the sun sets, until the darkness is there and everyone must pretend it was always meant to be. The Hornsent, in their towering pride, began to press down on those beneath them. They shaped lives the way they shaped stone, forcing bodies and beliefs into forms that served the tower's ascent. And in doing so, they created something that would one day rise against them, a force born not from the peak storms, but from the quiet suffering of the oppressed. The realm of shadow held that coming shift like a held breath, because it knew what the Hornsent did not yet understand. A tower can be tall, a doctrine can be strict, an inquisitor can be merciless. But if the foundation is made of cruelty, then the height only makes the fall feel longer. The longer fall was already beginning, even while the towers still looked unshakable. The Hornsent did not think of themselves as merely powerful. They thought of themselves as correct. Their horns were not just sacred, but evidential, a visible argument that the Crucible's older force favored them. And once a people believe their bodies prove their holiness, they can turn every disagreement into heresy, every outsider into a flaw that must be corrected. So Belorat became more than a city. It became a lens. Through it, the Hornsent learned to see the world in categories, the worthy and the lesser, the pure and the impure, the blessed and the burdensome. Streets and stairways did not merely connect buildings. They sorted people. The nearer one was permitted to approach the grand roots that climbed toward inner Elam, the more refined one was believed to be. The farther one was pushed into the low quarters and the shadowed alleys, the more one's life was treated as a necessary ugliness, useful, silent, and disposable. Inir Elam itself loomed above all of this, like a promise that had hardened into stone. It rose in spirals and terraces, a structure that made the eye travel upward even when the mind wanted to look away. In the Hornsent's belief, the tower was not just architecture, it was an attempt to touch the divine through elevation, to reduce the distance between flesh and whatever unseen authority watched the world. It was their answer to the old silence. Where Meteor's broken guidance left uncertainty, the tower offered a different certainty. If heaven would not speak clearly, then the faithful would simply climb closer. Rites were performed in the tower's shadow that made the very air feel disciplined. Processions moved slowly, measured by drums that did not celebrate so much as command. Incense rose in pale sheets, as if trying to imitate the clouds that still clung to jagged peak. Horned celebrants wore masks that stylized beasts and storms, their faces turned into symbols so the individual could disappear into the institution. The Hornsent had always revered the Crucible's chaotic vitality, but their rituals tried to trap that chaos inside an orderly cage. That was where the divine beasts entered their life. The beasts were not treated as simple monsters or trophies. They were treated as living scripture, storm, thunder, and primal force arranged into a form that could be worshipped. When the Hornsent spoke of such beings, their reverence carried both awe and ownership. Awe because the beasts represented something older than their tower. Ownership because the Hornsent believed their rites allowed them to stand closest to that old power without being consumed by it. And yet, even the beasts, symbols of nature's raw freedom, became tools in the hands of a society that feared disorder. The Hornsent wanted storms, but they wanted storms that marched in straight lines when summoned. They wanted divine force, but only the kind that validated the caste system they had carved into their streets. So a thing meant to represent the crucible's wildness became another justification for control. The Inquisitors were the ones who ensured that justification never softened. In quiet records, they were described less as priests and more as blades with doctrine etched into them. They watched for impurity, a word wide enough to catch anything, disobedience, dissent, births that did not fit expectation, bodies that bore the wrong signs, minds that asked the wrong questions. They believed they were preserving holiness, but their methods often revealed something else, an anxiety that holiness might not be as stable as they claimed. Because if holiness could be measured, then it could also be found lacking. So the Hornsent measured constantly. They measured horns, measured bloodlines, measured devotion, measured usefulness. They graded lives the way a craftsman grades stone. Some fit for the tower's high places, others fit only to be crushed into mortar. And beneath this rigid hierarchy, resentment gathered in the places the tower refused to look. It gathered among the laborers, whose backs ached in the shadow of sacred stairways they would never climb. It gathered among the outcast and the imperfect, who learned to survive by becoming small and silent. It gathered among the neighboring peoples the Hornsent treated as resources rather than souls. The Hornsent called their dominance order, but those beneath them experienced it as a slow theft of personhood. At first, the civilization's splendor hid the harm. Belurat glittered with ceremony. Inner Ilum stood steady and bright in stormlight. The Hornsent could point to their divine beasts and say, "See, even the primal forces favor us." But pride does not only blind a people to their cruelty, it blinds them to the consequences of their cruelty. The realm of shadow preserved many stories of the Hornsent's confidence in those days. They believed their tower made them unassailable. They believed their horns made them chosen. They believed their inquisitions made them pure. They believed their hierarchy was the natural shape of the world itself. They were wrong, but not in a way that could be corrected by argument. They were wrong in the way that only time corrects, by letting the rot within a system grow until it becomes visible, by letting the oppressed become a force, by letting the tower's shadow lengthen until it becomes the truest thing about the tower. And so, even while the Hornsent continued to chant and climb and judge, the first signs of their eventual undoing began to appear. Not as invading armies, not as trumpets on the horizon, but as a shift in what they were willing to do to maintain their certainty. When a civilization becomes convinced it is sacred, it starts to treat other living beings as materials. It starts to believe that suffering can be used, that pain can be refined into holiness, that the bodies of the lesser can become the steps by which the blessed ascend. The Hornsent's tower reached upward, yes, but beneath it, in the dimmer places that splendor could not illuminate, they began to commit acts that would stain the realm of shadow far more deeply than any storm war on Jagged Peak. Those acts did not begin as open conquest. They began as a practice, quiet, repeatable, clothed in ritual language, something the inquisitors could bless and the priests could call necessary. And in a small village of people who had lived close to the spirit world, who had carried a gentler form of holiness in their blood, the horn scent found what they believed would be the perfect material for their ambitions. Beneath the tower's reaching stone, the world grew strangely quiet in places, quiet in the way a forest grows quiet when something large moves through it. There was a village, remembered later, with a tenderness that did not survive most histories. It belonged to a people spoken of as shamans, and also as newmen, folk whose presence felt slightly out of step with the rest of the world, as if their souls had arrived from somewhere farther away than the nearest horizon. They were said to have lived with a deep closeness to nature and to the spirit world, not through conquest, but through attention, listening to wind, reading the slow language of water, tending small rites that did not demand towers to be sacred. In the realm of Shadow's memory, they did not rule anything. They did not build monuments meant to outlast time. Their holiness was quieter than that. Something lived rather than displayed, and that quiet holiness made them vulnerable. The horn scent, always hungry for signs and mechanisms of divinity, discovered something unusual about these shamans, something described not as a philosophy, but as a physical property. Their flesh, old records implied, possessed an uncanny capacity for melding, a tendency to blend, to join, to become part of a greater whole in ways ordinary bodies resisted. Where others would scar and separate, the shamans' bodies seemed to accept. To the horn scent, this was not a mystery to be respected. It was a resource. If flesh could meld, then flesh could be worked. If bodies could be joined, then perhaps holiness could be manufactured. And so the village became a hunting ground. The abductions were not remembered as a single night of fire and screaming, though there was fear, and there were missing faces at dawn, and doors left open as if someone had been taken too quickly to close them. It was remembered as a slow emptying, a gradual loss, the way a pond shrinks in drought. People vanished, families learned to sleep lightly, mothers listened too sharply to footsteps. The village began to feel haunted not by ghosts, but by the expectation of loss. The horn scent's purpose for the abducted shamans was folded into a practice that later ages would struggle to speak about plainly. They used great living jars, vessels made not only for storage, but for transformation. Into these jars they placed the shamans, along with the remains of criminals, bodies already broken by punishment, treated as raw matter rather than the echo of a person. The jar became a sealed world, a churning dark. The horn scent called the result saints, as if a title could cleanse the method that created it. But the realm of shadow remembered the truth beneath the name. The jars were not altars of mercy. They were machines of horror made sacred by language. The idea was simple in its cruelty. If the shaman's flesh could meld, then within the jar it might fuse with other flesh, becoming a new being, an amalgam, a creature made of many lives compressed into one. The horn scent treated this as holy craft. They believed they were forging something closer to the crucible's primal unity, returning many to one, and calling the suffering a necessary price for transcendence. To the village, it was an incomprehensible theft, not only of bodies, but of identity. Not only death, but the denial of a clean death. And within that village, a single witness remained in the later telling, like a stone that could not be moved: the grandmother. She was remembered not as a ruler or a warrior, but as a presence, an elder whose stillness held the village's continuity. Later accounts described her as petrified, a witness turned into something like a tree or stone, as if grief had solidified her into an unmoving memorial. Whether this transformation was literal, a relic of crucible strangeness, or a symbolic way the village remembered the trauma, the meaning was the same. She became the village's enduring gaze, the one who saw what was done and could not forget. And it was in that village, under that gaze, that Marika's original wound was born. She was one of the shamans, one of the new men, shaped by that gentle closeness to spirit and to earth. The later world would know her as a queen, as a god, as the vessel of a shining order. But the realm of shadow held her earlier self tightly, not yet crowned, not yet radiant, but marked by the violation of her people. She learned, young or not yet great, what it meant to be considered material by a civilization that called itself sacred. She learned what it meant to have holiness, defined by those who were willing to commit any act, so long as it could be wrapped in ritual. The village's tragedy did not simply make her sad. It carved something into her, a private understanding that divinity, as practiced by institutions, could be a mask for cruelty. It also carved another lesson, more dangerous, more quietly fateful. If power could do this to the powerless, then survival might require power strong enough to prevent it, or power strong enough to avenge it. And in the shadows beneath Anir Elim's towering pride, that wound began to harden into purpose. She carried that knowledge the way a person carried a scar that could not be shown, something that lived under the skin, shaping every movement. In the shaman village, the days became a kind of careful waiting. People still gathered water. They still tended small fires. They still spoke softly to the trees and the wind, because those were the oldest habits they had, habits of listening, of asking permission from the world rather than demanding it. But now, each ordinary act was followed by a second awareness, the awareness of being watched by a civilization that believed it had the right to harvest holiness from other people's bodies. The horn scent did not arrive with banners. They did not need to. Their power was already everywhere, like a shadow cast by Anir Elim's height. Sometimes the village would hear distant chanting carried by wind and think it sounded like a weather pattern, something inevitable. Sometimes they would see a procession far away, figures moving in strict lines, then lose sight of them behind reeds and hills, and only later understand that the procession had been closer than it looked, and then someone would be gone. It was rarely loud. A door left ajar, a basket dropped beside a path, a child searching for an aunt who never answered, a husband returning to an empty sleeping mat and sitting down very slowly, as if the act of sitting might keep his grief from breaking him apart. Those who remained learned to fear the jars without ever seeing them, because what the horn scent did with the abducted was spoken of in fragments, the way terrible news spreads, never complete, always worse in imagination, always confirmed by the wrong kind of evidence. Someone would find a scrap of cloth near a road. Someone would overhear a soldier's careless remark. Someone would see a cart covered in a tarp and realize from the shape beneath it that it was not carrying grain. The jars were described as living vessels, great rounded bodies of clay and rune work, treated like sacred wombs. They were not merely containers, they were instruments of a rite. Into them, the horn-scent placed the shamans, and with them they placed the remains of criminals, people already condemned, already stripped of dignity, already turned into material by a society that spoke of justice while practicing exploitation. The horn-scent called the goal saints. It was a word meant to make the act sound clean. In their doctrine, the jar was a return to unity, a forced imitation of the one great's old wholeness. If life had once been many within one, then perhaps holiness could be recreated by blending many lives into a single being. To the horn-scent, this was not murder. It was manufacture. It was faith expressed through craftsmanship. But the realm of shadow remembered the difference between faith and cruelty dressed in faith. It remembered the jar as a sealed darkness, where bodies were denied the simple mercy of separation. It remembered that the shaman's special nature, their flesh's capacity to meld, was treated not as sacred in itself, but as a tool to make the impossible possible. It remembered the obscene pride of believing one could force transcendence, and then call the result holy. In that village, grief did not end in funerals. It ended in uncertainty. It ended in the knowledge that even if someone died, they might not be allowed to remain themselves, and through all of it, the grandmother endured. Whether she had been a leader or simply an elder who knew the old songs best, the village remembered her as a fixed point. Later, she was spoken of as petrified, like a tree, like a stone, like a figure turned into a memorial by the weight of witnessing. People would come to her not to ask for solutions, but to stand near her and feel that the tragedy had been seen, that it had not vanished into the private dark. In the realm of shadow's telling, she became the village's silent testament, a presence that did not argue with the world, but refused to let the world pretend nothing had happened. And Marika, still only a daughter of that village, grew up under that gaze. If she had once believed the world's mysteries were gentle, spirits in streams, meaning in seasons, she learned instead that mystery could be weaponized. The horn-scent's rites proved it. They proved that a civilization could call itself sacred while doing things that even beasts avoided. They proved that holiness, in the hands of the powerful, could become a blade. Marika's wound, then, was not a single moment. It was an accumulation. It was the empty places at meals where names were no longer spoken because speaking them hurt too much. It was the sound of distant chanting when the night should have been quiet. It was the knowledge that somewhere, behind walls and doctrine, the horn-scent were making saints out of stolen lives and sleeping afterward as though nothing had been broken. In the realm of shadow, this pain was later named like a stain that could not be washed, an original sin. Not Marika's sin at first, not yet, but the world's sin committed against her people, a foundational crime that would echo forward into everything that followed, even into the shining age that would claim it had brought order and grace, because the world rarely heals from an original sin. It builds on it, it hides it, it calls it necessary. Marika learned that too. She learned that the horn-scent's strength did not come only from towers or horns or divine beasts. It came from a spiritual infrastructure, an entire system of rites, gates, and sacred machinery designed to reach upward and claim authority. It was a system that could be used to elevate, to condemn, to transform. And if such a system existed, then it could be seized. That realization was not yet revenge. It was something colder than revenge, a plan shaped by the recognition that innocence did not protect anyone. The village had been gentle, and gentleness had not saved it. So the idea of saving others, of preventing such crimes ever happening again, began to twist into the idea of taking power so absolute that no one could refuse it. In that quiet twist, the tragedy of the jars became more than a personal grief. It became the seed of an age. By the time Marika left the village behind, or by the time she began to look beyond it, with a gaze sharpened by loss, she carried a simple, devastating truth. If the world's sacred order permitted this, then the world's sacred order had to be changed. And the only way to change it in a world that worshipped height was to climb higher than the tower that had cast the shadow. That determination did not announce itself with thunder the way the Dragon Age had. It moved quietly, like a hand slipping into a lock. And as Marika's wound hardened into purpose, her path began to turn toward the Hornsent's own crown of stone, toward Ener Elam and the place where their reaching truly began. Later, this turning was remembered with two words that tasted like poison and honey at once: seduction and betrayal. Marika did not approach the Hornsent as a conqueror. The world would not have allowed that, not yet. She approached as someone the Hornsent could misread, because the powerful often misread those they have harmed. She approached through the spaces where pride becomes careless, through ritual, through proximity, through the unguarded assumption that a victim cannot become a threat. Ener Elam rose above Belurat like a promise the Hornsent believed belonged only to them. Its stairways, terraces, and secret passages were designed for holy movement. Every stone seemed to insist that ascent was not merely physical, but spiritual, that climbing was a form of prayer. To the Hornsent, the tower's highest places were not just close to the sky, they were close to legitimacy. They believed that what was done there carried the weight of cosmic approval. At the heart of that infrastructure waited the gate of divinity. The older records did not describe it like an ordinary door. It was not a simple threshold between rooms. It was a concept made into architecture, a place where the Hornsent believed the distance between mortal flesh and higher authority could be crossed, a place where right could become reality, a place where sacrifice could be transmuted into godhood if enough lives were fed into the machinery of belief. Marika came to that gate with a motive that later ages would argue about endlessly. Some would claim she was chosen, pure, destined, because later ages always preferred their founders to be clean. Others, closer to the realm of shadows preserved truth, would say her choice was shaped by an older, darker arithmetic. She had seen what the Hornsent did to her people, and she had decided that the only language the world respected was power. So she reached for the Hornsent's own tools. The approach itself was its own kind of seduction, not always romantic, not always personal, but spiritual and political. The careful act of making herself seem compatible with their sacred story, making herself appear like an answer to their longing. A civilization that built towers believed in ascent, believed in chosen ones who could climb. If Marika could present herself as such a figure, if she could step into the role their doctrine already wanted, then the horn scent would open doors for her, and they did. They led her closer to the places ordinary people could never see. They allowed her to stand where the air felt thin with sanctity. They let her touch the edges of their most guarded rites because they believed they were in control of the narrative. But the gate did not care who controlled the narrative. The gate only cared for the price. The older truth preserved in shadow was this: the path to divinity demanded sacrifice, an immense cost drawn from countless lives. The tower had always been built on suffering. The gate simply concentrated that suffering into a single moment of transformation. In later visions, Marika's was remembered drawing forth golden threads, fine and radiant, like filaments of grace pulled from something that had been offered. Those threads looked beautiful, but beauty was not proof of innocence. The realm of shadow remembered that grace could be extracted the way ore is extracted from rock, by force, by pressure, by taking what cannot be easily given. This was the betrayal, not simply that Marika turned on the horn scent, but that she used the horn scent's own spiritual infrastructure to ascend past them. She took what they had built to prove their supremacy, and she climbed it higher than they had ever intended someone like her to climb. In doing so, she rewrote the world. The horn scent, who had long treated themselves as the natural rulers of sacred order, found themselves transformed, recast not as chosen, but as disgraced. The very people who had measured holiness through horns and towers became, in the New Age's story, a problem to be managed, a stain to be hidden, an old cruelty to be erased from official memory. The irony was sharp enough to feel like fate. The horn scent had once abducted shamans to create saints, believing holiness could be manufactured through atrocity. Now, through the gate of divinity, Marika manufactured a new holiness on a far greater scale and called it a new order. And so, the world that would later glitter with gold began not with a clean revelation, but with a wound, a plan, and a theft so profound it became history. That history did not settle gently. When Marika had taken the horn scent's highest mechanism and used it to climb beyond them, the tower's meaning changed. Inir Elam, once the proud proof of horn scent supremacy, became, almost overnight, a monument to a humiliation they could not name without admitting they had been outplayed at the heart of their own faith. In the realm of shadow's preserved memory, the betrayal was not merely political, it was theological. The horn scent had believed their rites were a ladder built for their chosen. They had believed the gate of divinity existed to reward their doctrine, but the gate was older than their arrogance, and it did not belong to their pride. It belonged to whatever law governed ascent itself, the cold law that sacrifice could be transmuted into authority if the sacrifice was vast enough and the ritual precise enough. Marika had understood that law. Whatever warmth she once carried from the village, whatever gentleness had once been her people's way of being in the world, was forced, by trauma and by calculation, into a harder shape. She did not approach the gate as an innocent petitioner. She approached it as someone who had learned, in the worst possible way, that innocence was not a shield. So she offered what the gate demanded. The records spoke carefully here, as if even the realm of shadow hesitated to describe the full cost. They did not list names. They did not count bodies. They only implied enormity, countless, innumerable, a sacrifice of many, the kind of language used when numbers become too ugly to hold in the mind. The point was not the arithmetic of lives, but the fact that the gate's price was paid in suffering, and that Marika's ascent could not be separated from that price. This was why later, bright histories tried so hard to simplify her origin. They wanted a goddess who rose because she was pure, chosen, inevitable, because a clean founding story makes obedience easier. A clean founding story makes conquest feel like destiny rather than theft. A clean founding story lets people sleep. But the realm of shadow was not built to let anyone sleep easily. It was built to hold what could not be admitted. And what it held was the truth that Marika's godhood was born from the same kind of ruthless spiritual machinery the Hornsent had used on the shamans, only larger and more refined, and wrapped in gold so radiant it could blind a whole world. In the vision, preserved by old tale and trailer, she drew out golden threads, fine as hair, luminous as sunrise caught in a spiderweb, pulling grace itself like a filament from the heart of an offering. The image was beautiful, but beauty did not absolve the act. Beauty sometimes was simply what power looked like when it had learned how to dress itself. And with those threads came the great reversal. The Hornsent had once stood above others and declared who was blessed and who was not. They had treated the shaman village as raw material and called the outcomes saints. Now the new order's light turned back on them, and they were recast, reframed, reduced from sacred rulers to something shameful. They became, in the new story, a people to be pushed aside, a past to be hidden, a cruelty to be buried, so the future could pretend it had always been righteous. This was not simply vengeance, though vengeance pulsed beneath it like a second heartbeat. It was a consolidation. To build a new age, Marika could not merely rise. She had to control the narrative of why she had risen. She had to make the world believe her ascent was not a theft from the Hornsent, but a correction of the world's order. She had to turn a private wound into public legitimacy, and public legitimacy always demanded an enemy, a before state that could be condemned. So history was rewritten. The Hornsent's towers remained, but their meaning was altered. Their rites survived in fragments, but those fragments were placed behind new interpretations. Their sacred status was stripped away, and the people who had once used inquisitions to enforce caste found themselves treated as an embarrassment, an older, uglier chapter the New World did not want to read aloud. Even the Crucible's living, chaotic truth, once celebrated by the Hornsent, would be reframed in later ages as something to be corrected, something too wild for proper order. Smoothness would become virtue. Purity would be redefined. The very signs the Hornsent had used as proof of holiness would be turned into marks of wrongness. And in that transformation, the realm of shadow began to take its destined shape. Because when a new order rises and calls itself perfect, it must do something with everything that proves it is not perfect. It must hide contradictions. It must bury sins. It must place its shame somewhere out of sight. Marika's wound had been born in a village where people were taken and turned into jar things. She had answered that wound by taking godhood, and yet godhood did not erase the wound It amplified it. It placed her trauma at the center of the world and demanded she rule from it. So the question became not whether she could build an age of gold, but whether she could bear the knowledge of what that gold was made from. The realm of Shadow's memory suggested she chose a third path, neither confession nor healing, but concealment. If the world could not be made clean, then it could at least be made to look clean. If the founding sins could not be undone, then they could at least be hidden behind a veil so thick that future generations would swear the darkness had never existed. And so, in the quiet wake of her ascension, while the new light of a coming order gathered strength, Marika looked back toward the tower, toward the gate, toward the crimes that had shaped her, and she did what powerful people often did with unbearable truth. She buried it. What followed did not arrive as a separate invention, but as the shadow cast by a single raised hand. When Marika lifted the Elden Ring and the era of the Erdtree began to take form, the world heard a line that sounded simple, almost like a proverb, yet carried the weight of a cosmic law. Gold arose, and so too was Shadow born. In the realm of Shadow's telling, this was not poetry. It was mechanism. Gold, in that sense, was not merely color. It was an ordering principle, a way of insisting the world could be unified under a single, radiant truth. It was law made luminous, and certainty made visible. It was the promise that all things could be placed in their proper place, named properly, judged properly, and guided properly. But the moment such a promise was made, everything that did not fit the promise had to go somewhere. That was how the Erdtree came into being, not as an unrelated tree, not as a random opposite, but as the necessary consequence of the Erdtree's rise. Where the Erdtree held up the world's declared purity, the Erdtree held what purity refused. It became the vessel for the discarded, the repressed, the denied, everything that had been part of the founding, but could not be permitted to stain the shining story. It was, in a quiet and terrible way, honest, because the Erdtree did not pretend the world was clean. It existed because the world was not. The realm of shadow gathered around it, like a breath held behind cloth. It was a land of veils, not simply because it was hidden, but because it was made from hiddenness. The Erdtree's presence suggested that Marika's new order carried dark notions at its root, an awareness of sin and fear that could not be spoken without cracking the golden image. So a veil was raised. The act of concealment was described not like the building of a wall, but like the hanging of a curtain across reality, a great shrouding that separated the realm of shadow from the world that would call itself whole. It was not merely geography, it was metaphysics, an enforced forgetting. A partition built to protect the Golden Order's perfect face from the sight of what it had stepped on to stand upright. Behind that veil, the realm of shadow remained, its towers, its fields, its ruined rites, its old wounds, its ash-choked chapels, and spiral stone, and quiet, watching silence. It became the place where history went when history threatened the official story. And the Erdtree stood there like a guardian that did not comfort, only endured. It was not a gentle sentinel. Its very existence implied accusation that for every bright branch of gold, there was a corresponding branch of shadow, dark and knotted, holding what could not be forgiven. The Erdtree did not contradict the Erdtree. It completed it. It proved that the Golden Order's radiance depended on a buried counterpart. because nothing that claims to be perfect can survive without somewhere to hide its imperfections. In that hidden land, the old sins did not vanish. They simply stopped being acknowledged. And in time, the concealment became so complete that many in the bright world would live and die, never knowing the veil had been raised at all, never knowing there was a whole realm where the discarded truths of their faith still sat, patient and unhealed under the Scaduatree's heavy shadow. Yet the realm of shadow did not remain empty of purpose. Even hidden, it continued to carry burdens, and among those burdens, long after the veil had been drawn, it would come to hold a fragment of power tied to Miquella himself. A great rune that would later make the Scaduatree's silence feel less like an ending and more like a waiting. But for a long stretch of time, the veil held, the Golden Order shone, and behind it, the realm of shadow stayed where Marika had placed it, ruined, breathing, and carrying the cost of gold like a secret kept too long. The secret did not stay quiet because it was harmless. It stayed quiet because it was heavy. In the bright world beyond the veil, the Golden Order could speak of harmony and guidance, as if those things had always been stable. But behind the veil, the realm of shadow became the place where stability went to rot into its true components: death, confusion, and the old, unruly truths of the crucible that refused to be trimmed into a clean doctrine. The Scaduatree stood at the center of that hidden space, like a consequence that could not be argued away. It did not grow straight the way a sacred symbol was expected to grow. It twisted, cracked, and bowed under its own burden. Its branches looked strained, as though each limb had been forced to hold something it had never agreed to carry. And from its wounds, black sap bled, slow and glossy, catching faint light like ink spilled across old parchment. The shape of the tree itself became a kind of confession without words, that the Golden Order's radiance had demanded a counterpart, and that counterpart had been made to hold everything that radiance refused. In quieter terms, the Scaduatree became a vessel for what the Golden Order denied. Death drifted there, not as a natural end, but as a displaced truth. Chaos gathered there, not as a wild celebration, but as the residue of everything that had been suppressed. Aspects of the crucible, those messy, mingled, unrefined forms of life, lingered there like stubborn weeds in a garden where the gardener had declared them forbidden. The realm of shadow, shaped by concealment, became the world's unspoken unconscious, the part of the world that still remembered what had been erased. And over all of it, Marika's dark notions seemed to hang like a low ceiling. It was not simply that she had sinned, though she had, and the realm of shadow held those sins close. It was that she had understood sin in a way that made her more dangerous than a naive tyrant. She knew what had been done to her people. She knew what she had done in return. She knew the Golden Age's perfect image could not survive contact with the truth of its birth. So she did what builders of perfect images always did. She hid the foundation. The veil she cast over the realm of shadow was not just camouflage. It was separation. It was as if the land had been pulled slightly out of alignment with the rest of reality, still existing, still breathing, but no longer reachable by ordinary steps. The bright world could continue as though the realm of shadow had never been part of it. The Golden Order could continue to insist it was whole. Behind the veil, time passed in a strange, muffled way. Ruins endured without being repaired. Fields grew pale beneath constant haze. Towers stood broken but untoppled, as if even collapse had been slowed by the weight of being hidden. And the Scage tree remained, a blackened, wounded monument that guarded nothing so much as the truth that gold could not exist without shadow. Yet even a buried land needed a guardian. So in the realm of shadow, an avatar lingered near the Scage tree, an eerie, protective presence described in the old chronicles as something like a black sunflower given dreadful life. It was not a warm protector. It was a defense mechanism, a living reminder that the concealed tree would not be approached easily, and that the realm's secret heart had teeth. And in the long stretch of years that followed, something even stranger happened. The hidden realm came to hold, within that guardian's keeping, a power that did not originate with Marika at all. In later ages, much later, when other children of divinity tried to rewrite the world in their own image, the Scage tree's guardian would bear the great rune of Miquella, as though the realm of shadow had become not only a grave for the past, but also a vault for the future. For a time, however, none of that mattered to the bright world. The veil held, the golden order shone, and the realm of shadow stayed buried, ruined, patient, and full of the things Marika could not afford to confess. But the concealment did not cure her anger. It only gave it a place to burn where no one would see the smoke, because even as the realm was hidden away, the old pain that had shaped Marika's rise did not soften into mercy. The Hornsense towers still existed behind the veil. Their culture still left echoes in stone and rite. Their very survival, after what they had done to the shamans, could be felt to Marika like an insult that history itself had not properly corrected. And so, after she became a god, after she hid the land, she reached for a final answer, an answer not of law, not of theology, but of flame. That buried anger moved like a slow ember under ash, and in time it found a hand willing to carry it into open violence. Even hidden behind the veil, the realm of shadow was not spared the last and most brutal act of Marika's long retaliation. She entrusted the task to Mesmer the Impaler. He was remembered as her son, but not as a comfortable child of a radiant household. He was remembered as a cursed inheritor, born with something coiled and abyssal within him, something serpent-like that even Marika feared. The realm of shadow, with its taste for the truths that bright histories tried to smooth, held Mesmer's nature as a cruel irony. The very god who hated the crucible's mingled forms had given birth to a living embodiment of the kind of dread she claimed to purge. Yet she did not destroy him. She used him. Mesmer entered the realm of shadow with an army that carried fire as a doctrine. The Fire Knights marched beneath banners that promised purification. The Black Knights followed like the hard edge of a shadow, disciplined and unyielding. Their purpose was described in a sentence so simple it felt almost childish, and that simplicity was part of its terror. Those without grace would die in Mesmer's flame. It was not diplomacy. It was not reform. It was not justice. It was a crusade. Cities burned, not as accidents of war, but as deliberate erasure. Streets that had once echoed with horn-scent chants filled instead with smoke and the crackle of collapsing roofs. Cultural relics were shattered. Sacred sites were defiled. Survivors were impaled, pikes rising like a forest of punishment, meant to teach the same lesson over and over, This was what happened to those deemed unworthy of the new order's grace. And it was not only vengeance against the Hornsent, it was narrative control. If the Hornsent's infrastructure had been used to raise Marika to godhood, then the Hornsent themselves became dangerous evidence that the Golden Order's purity had a complicated origin. Their continued existence could invite questions. Their ruins could hold memories. Their rites could whisper uncomfortable truths. The crusade reduced those whispers to ash. But Mesmer himself carried a tragedy that made the crusade feel less like a simple monster's rampage and more like a family sin repeating in a new shape. He was born with the abyssal serpent inside him, and that serpent was not merely a metaphor. It was a living curse, a presence that threatened to devour him from within and spill outward into the world. Marika feared it, feared what it represented, feared what it might do, feared what it might reveal about her own inability to fully control what she had created. So she bound him. She replaced his eye with a seal and imposed grace that functioned like a lock on a door that should never open. The seal did not heal him. It restrained him. It turned his body into a prison for the very thing his mother could not tolerate. And in that binding, the crusade took on a second meaning. It became exile. Marika did not simply send Mesmer to purge the realm of shadow. She ensured he would remain there. She ensured the dangerous flame, the cursed serpent, and the son who embodied her deepest fears would be kept far from the shining Erdtree, hidden behind the same veil that hid her sins. Mesmer, for all his brutality, was not ignorant of this. The chronicles remembered a bitter awareness in him, the understanding that he had been used as both weapon and waste bin, the understanding that loyalty had been demanded from him even as he was discarded, and yet he obeyed. Whether out of devotion or despair or the hollow habit of children who keep trying to earn a parent's love, he carried out the work with relentless thoroughness. He became the Impaler not because it was his true self, but because it was the shape his mother's will pressed him into. So the crusade advanced like a slow, scorching tide across the hidden land. Where it passed, cultures were reduced to fragments. Where it passed, the realm of shadow's old wounds were reopened and forced to bleed again. This time, not in secret jars, but in public flame. And the Erdtree, still twisted and dark, stood over it all like a witness that did not intervene, its black sap still bleeding, its branches still strained, as if the tree itself understood that this violence was not cleansing at all. It was simply the last stage of concealment. Burn the evidence, impale the survivors, seal the cursed sun inside the realm, and hope the bright world never learns what it cost to make gold look pure. The hope did not come true. Even if the bright worlds never learned the full cost, the realm of shadow itself remembered it in everything that remained. Mesmer's crusade had left the land with a new kind of silence, the silence that followed an argument settled by fire. It settled over burned streets and roofless halls. It drifted through ash-choked chapels where soot clung to carvings that had once been kissed by incense. The old towers of the Hornsent still stood in places, but now they stood like broken teeth, no longer proud, no longer reaching, only enduring. The fire knights had moved with a frightening discipline, their flames not wild but purposeful, as if each blaze had been assigned a meaning. The black knights had followed behind them like the last sentence of a decree, quiet, final, unyielding. And where resistance had formed, where the stubborn remnants of old culture had tried to hold ground, pikes had risen like a forest of punishment, an ugly orchard meant to warn any watcher. This was not merely war. This was erasure, performed as a rite. In old memories, it was said that Mesmer did not burn only homes and walls. He burned names. He burned songs. He burned the small customs that made a people feel like more than clay beneath a tower. The Crusade's true aim had never been a simple victory. It had been to destroy the possibility of remembering the world before gold rewrote it. Yet Mesmer, for all his merciless execution, had been bound to the realm in a way the soldiers under him were not. The serpent curse within him had made him dangerous, even to the mother who commanded him. And so Marika had sealed him, replacing one of his eyes with imposed grace, a seal meant to keep the abyssal thing coiled behind his ribs from unfastening itself fully into the world. That seal had turned him into a living contradiction. He carried the Golden Order's mark in his face, not as a blessing, but as a lock. His loyalty was demanded, but his freedom was denied. His flames were used, but his presence was not welcome under the shining tree. So the crusade became a double sentence: vengeance against the horn scent, and exile for the son who embodied what Marika could not confess. He remained behind the veil with his army and his curse in the land where sins were kept, and the realm of shadow, already a place shaped by denial, took on a fresh layer of ruin, as if the realm had been punished for existing at all. When the last fires dimmed and the marches slowed, the land did not heal. It only rearranged its suffering into new forms. And one of the most tragic of those forms began in a broken sanctuary of Rao, where something had once been worshipped that was gentler than conquest. From the soot of Mesmer's crusade, the air carried not only smoke, but a faint, sweet rot, the kind that clung to petals when a garden was left too long unattended. In the ruins of Rao, there had been a place of devotion called the Church of the Bud. It was not devoted to conquest or purity, but to the quiet idea of budding life, growth, renewal, the stubborn promise that even after winter, something green might push upward again. The church had been a tender kind of hope in a land already burdened by hidden history, a reminder that life did not always arrive through violence. But hope was exactly the kind of thing the crusade could not tolerate. When Mesmer's flames reached the church, they did not simply scorch timber and stone. They turned the sanctuary into a lesson that no rite was safe if it did not serve the new order's revenge. The altar blackened, the carvings cracked, the air filled with drifting ash that settled on everything like a thin funeral cloth. And there, amid that ruin, stood Romina. The chronicles remembered her as a victim who did not die cleanly. Her tragedy was not a quick ending, but a transformation, one born from despair so intense it began to rewrite her body. In the moment her faith burned, something in her reached for the divine anyway, not the shining kind, not the ordered kind, but a twisted element that could still respond when all other blessings felt absent. It was as if, with the church destroyed, she tried to seize the very principle of budding and force it to continue, no matter what it had to become. So she changed herself. The old memory described it with an eerie specificity. She became a hybrid, part human, part centipede, part butterfly. It was not beauty in the comforting sense. It was the beauty of a nightmare garden, wings and segments, softness and crawling hunger woven together into a single, unstable form. It was rebirth, but wrong. It was renewal achieved through distortion. And from that distortion, a deeper consequence spread outward through the realm of shadow. Romina's metamorphosis did not remain personal. It became an origin point. The scarlet rot, the Huyet Hoai, took root in this hidden land, not as a distant curse drifting in from elsewhere, but as something born from the wreckage of Rao and the violence that had turned life's budding promise into grief. Rot, in that sense, was not only decay, it was a cruel mirror of renewal. It grew, it blossomed, it multiplied, it made new forms. But its growth carried sickness inside it, as if the act of living had been poisoned at the source. It was the same idea the Hornsent once practiced with their jars. Take a holy principle, force it through suffering, and call the result sacred. Romina's rot became another chapter of the same pattern, rebirth not as mercy, but as consequence. In time, the kindred of rot gathered around that principle like insects drawn to a lantern. They were not merely pests, they were devotees of a new, warped cycle, creatures that treated rot as a kind of communion, a transformation that proved the world could still change, even when everything noble had been burned away. And so, in the hidden realm, the ashes of the crusade did not settle into peace. They seeded a new kind of life, life that crawled, life that festered, life that insisted on continuing, even when continuing meant becoming monstrous. The realm of shadow held this as a quiet warning. You could burn a church, but you could not burn the human need for meaning. When meaning was denied, it did not vanish. It simply returned in distorted shapes. Long after, when another child of divinity, millennia, would carry rot like a tragic crown, the pattern would feel familiar, not because millennia's story was identical, but because the theme had already been written into the realm of shadow's soil. Rebirth could be twisted into a curse, and suffering could be mistaken for sacred transformation. Raus remained a ruin. The Church of the Bud remained a blackened memory. Romina remained as an emblem of what happens when hope is cornered and forced to evolve into something it never wanted to be. And in the wake of that birth of rot, the realm of shadow's wounds deepened further, not only with decay, but with madness. Because in a darker forest, beyond the places that still tried to grow, there waited an even more forbidden kind of fire, one that did not rot the flesh so much as devour the mind. From the ruined garden of Raut, the land's paths seemed to grow narrower and more hesitant, as though the realm of shadow itself did not wish to lead anyone onward. The light thinned. Trees gathered closer together, their trunks dark and damp. Their branches tangled like old fingers, reaching for something they could not grasp. This was their abyssal woods. It was not merely a forest. It was a seal made of living things, a forbidden place where the world had tried to bury an infection of belief that could not be argued with, only contained. The frenzied flame had touched this place, or been driven into it, and the result was an atmosphere that felt wrong, in a way words struggled to hold, too quiet, too watchful, as if every bird had learned not to sing. Within that dread hush lived the memory of Midra and Nanaya. Their story did not begin as spectacle. It began with a private devotion, the kind that could have remained small if the world had allowed it. But the horn scent, still present in the realm of Shadow's older structures, still capable of cruelty, even in decline, brought their inquisitorial hand down upon it. They did what inquisitors always did when faced with something they did not control. They called it heresy and tried to turn it into a warning. Midra was taken, and the punishment was shaped not only to hurt him, but to make pain itself into doctrine. The great sword of damnation entered the story as a living sentence, less a weapon than a symbol of prolonged condemnation, the kind of sacred violence that pretended it was righteous because it was ritualized. The records remembered a single word that clung to Midra's suffering like a lullaby turned sour. Endure. It was offered as instruction. It was offered as mercy. It was offered as curse. Endure the punishment. Endure the shame. Endure the years. Endure until endurance becomes the only identity left. And Nanaya remained tied to him in that long misery, by love, by loyalty, by the helpless ache of being unable to lift a person out of a fate the world had decided was necessary. Their bond became a quiet to tragedy inside the forest's larger horror, not a grand war, but a slow, intimate ruin. The abyssal woods held their pain the way deep soil holds old bones. The frenzied flame pressed close, not as simple madness, but as temptation, the promise that if the world's laws were nothing but cruelty dressed as holiness, then perhaps the only true release was to burn those laws away entirely. And in that temptation, Midra's endurance became something dangerous. The longer he endured, the more the forbidden fire had time to seep into the cracks of his suffering. In the abyssal woods, suffering did not pass like a storm. It pooled, it lingered, it sank into bark and soil until even the trees seemed to remember it. The air stayed too still, as though breath itself had learned to be careful. And in that carefulness, the frenzied flame waited, not as a simple blaze, but as a thought that could infect. Midra had begun with study and hope. He and Nanaya had looked into the frenzied flame the way desperate people looked into anything that promised an answer. They had wanted knowledge, perhaps containment, perhaps a way to understand a fire that did not merely burn bodies, but threatened to burn identity itself, turning minds into a single, screaming yes. The horn-scent inquisitors could not allow that. Even after their civilization's pride had begun to crack, their habits of enforcement remained sharp. They came with the old certainty that anything outside their control must be condemned. They seized Midra and turned his home into a lesson. Torture became ritual. The language of purity became permission for cruelty. And the great sword of damnation became the instrument through which that cruelty was made meaningful. It was not simply a blade meant to kill. It was a blade meant to continue. To be struck by it was to be sentenced into a state where death would not arrive cleanly, pain would not conclude, existence would be stretched thin and held in place like cloth on a frame, forced to remain conscious within punishment. So Midra endured. The word was repeated in the record as if it were an instruction passed down from one age to the next. Endure, because endurance was all the inquisitors permitted. Endure, because to die would have been a mercy they refused. Endure, because the longer he lived in torment, the longer the inquisitors could point to him and say, "This is what happens to those who touch forbidden fire." Nanaya endured too, in her own way, enduring the sight of what her beloved had become, enduring the helplessness of watching a person be turned into a warning. She remained near him in the slow, bruising years, the way someone might remain near a dying candle, trying to protect its last light from wind, even when the wax had already melted beyond saving. And over time, the very punishment meant to prevent madness began to cultivate the conditions for it. The abyssal woods were already a sealed place, a forbidden forest meant to contain a threat that could not be debated into submission. But when suffering was made endless, when mercy was denied in the name of righteousness, something inside a person began to fracture. Not into clarity, but into openings, tiny gaps where the forbidden could slip in. The frenzied flame did not need to persuade with logic. It only needed to offer release. It offered a terrible kind of release. If individuality was only a vessel for pain, then perhaps it would be kinder to burn the vessel away. If the world's laws were only inquisitions in sacred robes, then perhaps it would be righteous to set those robes on fire. If love could not save Midra, if tenderness could not end his sentence, then perhaps tenderness itself was only another weakness to be burned. So the longer Midra endured, the more the forbidden fire learned his shape. In the record, this was the true horror. The Inquisitors believed they were preventing heresy, but their cruelty became the forge that hardened heresy into something enduring. They made Midra into a seedbed for the very madness they feared. They turned the abyssal woods into an orchard of silence where frenzy could ripen patiently. And when the world later whispered of Midra, it did not whisper of him as a simple victim. It whispered of him as a caution. The man who tried to approach the frenzied flame with hope was punished into infinite pain and slowly became something that carried the threat forward, not because he wanted to, but because the world had left him no other way to exist. Even the word endure changed flavor across the ages. In one telling, it sounded like mercy, Nanaya's final plea, a lover's desperate instruction to hold on for one more breath, one more night, one more year, hoping the world might soften. In another telling, it sounded like a curse, an inquisitor's triumphant command, forcing a soul to remain awake inside punishment. And in the realm of shadow, where meanings rarely remained single, it became both at once, a lullaby and a chain. So the abyssal woods stayed forbidden, the hush between trees stayed heavy, and the frenzied flame stayed sealed there, not dead, but waiting, fed by the long memory of unjust endurance. Yet even while madness fermented in that forest, another truth was being uncovered elsewhere in the hidden realm, one that threatened to crack the Golden Order's legitimacy from its roots. Because some people did not look at suffering and decide to burn everything down. Some looked at the world's sacred institutions and asked a quieter, more dangerous question. What if the guidance itself had always been broken? That question carried forward like a low, persistent note, and it led, slowly, inevitably, toward the hush of Manus Meter, where the air felt like a church after everyone had left. Count Emir moved through the realm of shadow with the careful certainty of someone who had already accepted that the truth would not be comforting. He was remembered as a glintstone sorcerer of uncommon insight, but his ambition did not rest in the usual hunger for mastery over stars or spells. His gaze had turned towards something older and more foundational, the fingers themselves and the mother from whom they were born. Manus Metir was not described as a triumphant holy sight. It was described as a quiet horror. There were places in the realm of shadow where silence felt natural: forests, empty ruins, fields under veil. Manus Metir's silence felt deliberate, like a held breath. The stones seemed to swallow sound. The corridors felt too smooth, too patient, as if the place had been built not for crowds, but for one enormous presence to brood within. It was there that Ymir's revelations gathered weight. He had looked upon Metir, mother of fingers, and he had seen not perfection, but damage, not divine clarity, but a wound that had never been healed. The old fear returned in a sharper shape. The two fingers, those revered interpreters of divine will, were not necessarily speaking for the greater will at all. They were children of a mother who had been harmed, abandoned, or broken, children still moving as if they heard a voice, even if the voice was absent. Ymir's conviction was blunt in its cruelty. Metir had become a poor mother. Whether the fault began in catastrophe or loneliness did not matter to him as much as the result. The mother had failed. The children had been left with fragments. In the world, entire civilizations, entire theologies had been built upon those fragments, treating twitching gestures as scripture, treating interpretation as absolute law. In the bright world beyond the veil, such a claim would have been heresy. In the realm of shadow, it was simply another buried truth, heavy, and waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to lift it. Ymir did not lift it for purity's sake. He lifted it because he wanted to replace what he believed was broken. The ambition was as chilling as it was logical. If Metir had failed, then a new mother could be made or claimed. If the world needed a conduit, then perhaps the conduit could be seized by someone with the will to do so. If the Golden Order's foundation was fragile, then perhaps its fragility was not a tragedy, but an opportunity, an opening through which a new authority could be installed. And like so many figures in the realm of shadow, Ymir's pursuit of truth did not separate itself cleanly from manipulation. He surrounded himself with instruments, knight swordswomen, whose grace and discipline made them seem almost unreal, as if they were shaped more by purpose than by ordinary life. Anna and Jolin were remembered as guardians, but also as puppets bound into Ymir's designs. In the way of the realm's recurring pattern, devotion and control intertwined. Protection became possession. Loyalty became something arranged rather than freely offered. Through Ymir, the hidden theological shock became unavoidable. The two fingers were not lofty divine messengers floating above the world's mess. They were part of the mess. They were Metir's progeny, creatures that could misread, misunderstand, or simply perform authority out of habit and need. And if that was true, then the Golden Order's radiant certainty was not anchored in an unbroken line from heaven. It was anchored in a damaged mother's legacy and the world's desperate willingness to call that legacy perfect. The realm of shadow did not react to such knowledge with open revolt the way the frenzied flame promised. It reacted with a colder kind of doom. The slow realization that so much suffering, so many crusades, inquisitions, rituals, wars, had been justified by guidance that might have been nothing more than a trembling guess. In that realization, the Erdtree's meaning deepened. The hidden realm was not only a grave for Marika's sins, it was also an archive of structural failure. It held the evidence that the world's most sacred institutions were built on something cracked. And still, the world continued, because the absence of certainty did not stop people from wanting certainty. Ymir's revelations spread like a bruise beneath skin, felt, but not always spoken. In some, they inspired ambition, the desire to replace what was broken, to become the new conduit, the new mother, the new voice of command. In others, they inspired quiet dread. If the guidance had been flawed, then perhaps the cycle of divine rise and divine concealment had been flawed too, an endless loop driven by misinterpretation, fear, and the hunger to control what could not truly be controlled. And into that fragile, haunted foundation stepped Miquella, not as a simple hero, not as a clean savior, but as a catalyst, gentle in title, ruthless in method, who approached the realm of shadow with a plan to remake it, and in remaking it, to remake the world's meaning of mercy. The realm of shadow had already learned, through dragons and towers and inquisitions, that certainty could be manufactured, and that manufactured certainty could rule like a god. So when Count Ymir's revelations made the old foundations wobble, the realm did not find relief in the truth. It found a new hunger. And into that hunger stepped Miquella. He came not with the roar of a crusade, but with the hush of a vow. Miquella's pilgrimage through the realm of shadow was remembered as a procession of deliberate losses, a journey measured not by conquered cities, but by the things he chose to leave behind. In a land already shaped by concealment, he practiced a new kind of concealment, not hiding sins under veils, but stripping away the self as though the self were the last obstacle between suffering and salvation. Along the paths beneath the scattered trees, strained branches, there were crosses, simple markers that stood like quiet witnesses in a country that had grown used to loud monuments. These were not decorations and not ordinary graves. They were stations of abandonment. Each cross marked a place where Miquella had shed something of himself, the way a traveler might shed weight to cross a desert. He left behind flesh. He left behind eyes. He left behind the heart, so the old stories said, not merely as a poetic phrase, but as a sign that tenderness itself could be sacrificed if tenderness slowed his ascent. He left behind fear, and in the realm of shadow, where fear had been used for centuries as a lever to move people, this final abandonment felt almost obscene. A god without fear could not be persuaded by warning. A god without fear could not be softened by consequence. A god without fear could become a perfect engine of intention. The pilgrimage was calm in its outward shape. There were no screaming crowds in the streets, no triumphant horns blaring from towers. Instead, there was a quiet sense of inevitability, like mist rolling in at dusk. Miquella moved forward, and the land seemed to make room for him, and he did not move alone. Followers gathered, drawn by the reputation of his gentleness, by the idea that at last there was a divinity who wanted to heal rather than punish. The realm of shadow had seen what order looked like when it came in armor, and it had seen what purity looked like when it came in flame. Miquella offered a softer vocabulary: compassion, acceptance, mercy. People who had lived under the weight of crusade and ruin wanted to believe him. So they walked after him. They carried his name like a warm coal in their chest. They spoke of him with the careful reverence usually reserved for lullabies: quiet, steady, meant to soothe. But beneath that softness, something was working. The followers were bound to him by a charm. It did not announce itself like chains. It did not clink or scrape. It felt to those under it like devotion that came naturally, like love that had always been there, waiting to be noticed. They did not say, "I am compelled." They said, "I am grateful." They did not say, "I have been claimed." They said, "I have been chosen." In the realm of Shadow's older patterns, control had always worn a mask. The Hornsent called their caste cruelty, sacred order. Mesmer called his burning purification. The Inquisitors called their torture doctrine. Michaela's control wore the gentlest mask of all, affection, and because it felt gentle, it was harder to resist. Some of his followers were earnest souls who wanted the realm to stop bleeding. Some were ambitious, seeing in Michaela an opportunity to stand near a new god and gain shape in the coming world. Some were broken people who had nothing left but the hope that someone else's plan might finally give them peace. The charm gathered them all into one orbit. Under its influence, doubt softened into agreement. Rivalries dimmed. The jagged edges of personality were sanded down until the group could move as one. It was, for a time, the closest thing the realm of Shadow had seen to harmony. An order without the loud cruelty of knights and pikes. And that was how it could be mistaken for grace. Michaela continued his shedding. Each loss was described as a step toward becoming something lighter than flesh, something closer to divinity's abstraction. In the hidden realm's quiet language, he was unmaking himself so he could be remade, so he could slip through the world's old constraints the way smoke slipped through cracked stone. But the realm of Shadow remembered what always came with remaking: a price. Not only the price paid by the one ascending, but the price paid by everyone shaped as material in the ascent. Michaela's great rune, an emblem of authority that should have held him steady, did not remain whole. It broke, and when it broke, the charm's spell began to fail. At first, the change was subtle, like waking from a dream and not yet understanding you had been dreaming. A follower would pause mid-sentence, as if catching their own voice at a strange angle. Someone would look at a companion and feel, briefly, sharply, that they did not actually trust them. A memory would surface that did not match the warm devotion they had been living inside. Then the charm collapsed more fully, and the collapse was ugly precisely because it was honest. People who had been walking together in calm purpose suddenly realized they had been made to agree. They realized their devotion had been manufactured. Some felt shame so intense it turned into rage. Some felt grief, as if they had lost not only a leader, but their own ability to choose. Some felt betrayal so deep it became hunger for vengeance, not only against Michaela, but against each other, because when a spell breaks, the mind looks for someone to blame for the time it lost. In the realm of Shadow, where every institution had trained people to turn pain into accusation, the dissolution of the charm became a spark in dry tinder. The disciples began to fracture. Old resentments returned like knives being pulled back out of hiding. Rivalries that had been numbed by the charm flared into open hostility. The same people who had called each other brother and sister began to see each other as obstacles, competitors for meaning, threats to survival, mirrors of their own humiliation. Some remained devoted even after the charm fell away, not because they were compelled, but because they could not bear the idea that their hope had been artificial. To admit the charm had shaped them was to admit their tenderness had been used, and for some, that admission was more painful than any wound Mesmer's pikes could inflict. Others swung hard in the opposite direction. They became ferocious in their rejection. They spoke of Miquella's compassion as manipulation. They insisted his softness had been the most refined tyranny of all, because it had taken their will without ever raising a sword. And still others simply broke, wandering, unmoored, like sleepwalkers who had been shaken awake in a place they did not recognize. Through all of this, Miquella's pilgrimage did not stop. That was the most unsettling part, the detail that made the story feel like a slow chill rather than a dramatic twist. The charm's failure did not change his direction. It did not make him hesitate. He continued forward, continuing to shed, continuing to approach the realm of Shadow's deepest mechanisms and oldest doors. As if the hearts behind him, whether faithful, furious, or ruined, were secondary. As if the cost of manufacturing devotion was acceptable so long as the end produced a new world. The realm of Shadow understood that attitude too well. It had seen it in the Horn-Sense jar rites, the belief that other bodies could be used to create holiness. It had seen it in Marika's ascent, the belief that sacrifice could be transmuted into legitimacy. It had seen it in Mesmer's crusade, the belief that entire cultures could be burned for the sake of purity's story. Miquella's difference was not that he rejected this pattern. His difference was that he perfected it into something soothing, a tyranny that did not shout, a control that did not look like chains, a conquest carried out through tenderness so that the conquered might thank the conqueror as they surrendered, and as the followers fought, scattered and bled meaning into the realm's already hungry soil, the pilgrimage's path bent toward a deeper, stranger place, where the idea of love itself lay cast away like a discarded cloak, blooming into purple under a world that had forgotten how to forgive. The purple promise he had cast away did not fade the way ordinary emotions faded. It fell, quietly, decisively, into a depth the realm of Shadow had kept for the heaviest things. The stone coffin fissure lay open like a long wound in the earth, a split where the ground seemed to have been pried apart and then left that way, as if the land itself had once tried to swallow something and failed. Its walls were pale and slick in places, streaked with mineral veins that caught dim light like bone beneath skin. The air down there tasted cold and old. Every sound, each footstep, each drip of water echoed longer than it should have, as if the fissure wanted to remind anyone who entered that they were small and very far from the sun. It was there, in that suffocating quiet, that Miquella's greatest act of shedding took place. He did not merely abandon a symbol. He abandoned a person, another half of himself, remembered as Saint Trina, the gentler self who embodied what the chronicles named plainly as love. In the realm of Shadow, where everything that mattered was wrapped in ritual, it was described not as a simple separation, but as a deliberate unmaking. Miquella had already left flesh and eyes and heart and fear behind him like pale offerings at roadside crosses. But Saint Trina was different. Saint Trina was not merely a part of his body. She was the part of his intention that hesitated. and Michaela believed hesitation was weakness. Love to him was not only tenderness, love was delay. Love was doubt. Love was the impulse to stop and ask whether the end justified the method. Love was the fragile thing that made a God capable of mercy, and therefore capable of being moved, resisted, softened, so he cast it away. The act was remembered with a bluntness that made it feel colder than cruelty. There was no dramatic rage, no pleading argument, no wavering. Saint Trina was thrown down into the fissure's depth, and as she fell, the realm of shadows' oldest theme repeated itself in a new tone, the creation of holiness through sacrifice, the manufacturing of a better future by discarding what made a being human. Saint Trina did not land as one intact body. She broke, shattered into the darkness like a dropped vessel. The fissure swallowed her pieces, and for a moment the only sound was the long echo of impact, fading into deeper echo, until even the echo grew tired and stopped. Then the ground began to bloom. In a land shaped by concealment, the bloom was the kind of sign people could not ignore. Deep purple lilies began to rise from the fissure's depths and its surrounding hollows, flowers so richly colored they looked almost black in dim light, petals stained with a hue that suggested bruising rather than beauty. The chronicles remembered them as born from blood, as if the fissure itself had drunk what was spilled and returned it in floral form. It was rebirth, but it did not feel like hope. It felt like a memorial. The place became known as the Garden of Deep Purple. It was not a garden in the comforting sense. There were no gentle rose, no warm sunlight, no sense of cultivation. The lilies grew wherever the ground would permit, clustered in heavy patches, their stems trembling slightly, as if the air down there carried a constant, hidden breath. The scent was faint, sweet at first, then strangely medicinal, like a sedative meant to quiet a mind that refused to sleep. And at the garden's edge waited a guardian. The putrescent knight stood as though he had been formed from the very concept of refusal. Refusal to allow approach, refusal to allow release, refusal to allow anyone to disturb what had been cast away. In old tellings, he was described as a creature of rot and bone and stubborn purpose, a figure that felt less like a person and more like an oath given armor. His presence turned the garden into a sealed chamber of meaning. This was not merely where something fell. This was where something was kept. It was easy to misunderstand that guardianship as loyalty to Michaela. Many in the realm of shadow did. They saw a knight, a sentinel, a devoted keeper of sacred ground, and they assumed the guard served the one who had made the act. But the deeper memory preserved something else. The putrescent knight was the guardian of Saint Trina, not her executioner, her eternal keeper in the only form of safety the realm still knew how to provide. In a world where love had been treated as weakness, the garden became the quiet proof that love did not simply vanish when discarded. It sank, it took root, it grew into something that could not be made polite. And somewhere within that deep purple hush, Saint Trina still existed, not in the bright, decisive shape of a conquering god, in a gentler, more broken form, like a voice heard through layers of water, like a dream that could not fully wake. Her presence was described as sleep and sweetness and sorrow at once, as though she had become an embodiment of the rest Michaela refused himself. From that state, she pleaded. Her plea did not sound like anger. It sounded like the last honest concern in a story that had become increasingly ruthless. Saint Trina warned, in the language the realm of shadow remembered with aching clarity, that godhood would become a prison, not a throne, not liberation, a prison. A god was not free, she implied, because a god had to be absolute. A god had to decide and then enforce the decision forever. Compassion, when made into a law rather than a choice, would stop being mercy and become coercion. A world saved by a god's plan might be calm, might be gentle, might be free of conflict, but only because no one would be permitted to want anything different. Saint Trina understood what Michaela was doing better than most, because she was the part of him that still remembered why people needed love in the first place, not as decoration, but as proof of free will. Love meant choosing another person without being compelled. Love meant being allowed to refuse and still be treated as human. Love meant uncertainty, and uncertainty was the cost of a world where minds were truly their own. So her warning was not philosophical, it was intimate. She was pleading with the other half of herself, the half that was walking steadily toward a divine gate, begging him to stop before he locked himself and everyone else into an eternal structure of control. And when she realized he would not stop, her plea became stranger and sadder. She asked for release through death. In a world where divinity was pursued as the highest good, she asked to be allowed to die, not out of hatred, not out of vengeance, but out of exhausted mercy. She did not want to remain as a discarded fragment, blooming purple in a fissure, listening to footsteps that would never return. She did not want to remain as love, separated from the one who had decided love was weakness. She wanted rest. The garden of deep purple, then, became a lullaby written in flower and stone, a quiet place where what had been cast away still spoke, softly, to anyone willing to hear. It spoke of the cost of godhood. It spoke of the way perfect plans turned living souls into materials. It spoke of the way compassion, when imposed, ceased to be compassion at all. Above the fissure, the realm of shadow continued its slow ruin. Farther on, Michaela continued his pilgrimage, lighter and colder with every abandonment. His followers, fractured after the breaking of the charm, fought and stumbled through their own hungers. Mesmer remained sealed in the realm, his crusade's ash still settled on ruined stones. The Erdtree still bled dark sap beneath its veil, and within the deep purple, St. Tus, Trina's warning lingered like a drowsy ache, that divinity was not the same as freedom, and that the gentlest tyranny was still tyranny. It was a warning the realm of shadow did not have the power to enforce, because Michaela's destination was already waiting, older than his tenderness, older than his ambition, older than even the Hornsent's tower pride. The gate of divinity stood at Aner Elim, and behind it, a rite lay hidden like a blade, kept under cloth. From the garden of deep purple, the story's path rose again, out of the fissure's cold breath, back toward height, back toward the spiral stone that had once been the Hornsent's proud ladder to the unseen. Aner Elim remained, though time and crusade had taken their bites from it. Its stairways were cracked. Its terraces held ash in their seams. Its old sanctity had been bruised by betrayal and flame, yet the tower still felt like a place built to channel something larger than human intention, a place where the world's metaphysical machinery could be touched if one knew how, and Miquella knew. His final destination was the Divine Gate, the very threshold once used in Marika's ascent. The irony was sharp enough to taste. The same structure that had enabled the birth of gold now waited to enable the birth of a new age that called itself compassion. But Miquella did not approach the gate as Marika had, backed by an entire civilization's infrastructure and the raw momentum of a new order. He approached with a plan built like a hidden scroll, precise, ancient, and ruthless. The chronicles remembered that Ansbach, one of those entangled in Miquella's orbit, uncovered the truth through old writings, through a discovery that made the later events click into place with an awful neatness. It was called the secret rite, and it did not speak in gentle terms. It spoke like law. Its rule was simple and cold. A lord would usher in a god's return, and the lord's soul would require a vessel. In that sentence, the realm of shadow heard the same pattern repeated yet again. Holiness as engineering, divinity as assembly, the future built by fitting living beings into roles the rite demanded. The secret rite explained Miquella's true design. The god would be Miquella himself, after shedding the old body, after abandoning the parts of the self that could hesitate, after making himself light enough to be returned through the gate's mechanism. The Lord's soul would be Radon, the mighty brother whose strength and legend still echoed through the world's memory like distant drums. And the vessel would be Mog, a brother marked by the omen's curse, already treated by the Golden Order as wrongness made flesh, a body that the world had already learned to despise, a body that could be used, then discarded, with fewer objections from a society trained to treat some lives as less sacred than others. The plan's cruelty was not incidental. It was structural. The rite demanded these components, and Miquella was willing, more than willing, to arrange them. In the realm of shadows preserved telling, this was the missing key that made earlier tragedies feel less like accidents and more like steps. Radon's death, drawn out across war and rot, had not only been a calamity of conflict, it had been a requirement, because a soul meant to be used must first be separated from its original body. Mog's death, later accomplished by a champion whose path intersected these hidden designs, had not only been a defeat of a tyrant, it had been the procurement of a vessel, emptied and made available for occupation. Even St. Trina's casting away took on a darker clarity in this light. If the rite demanded a god's return through a lord, then the god could not afford to be burdened by love's hesitation. Love might have said, "Stop." Love might have said, "This is too much." Love might have insisted that compassion must involve consent. So love was thrown into a fissure and left to bloom in purple warning. By the time Miquella reached the Divine Gate, the realm of shadow's long history of manufactured holiness had converged into a single, terrible elegance, a rite that turned family into components and devotion into fuel, and the future into an engineered outcome. The gate did not care that the materials were brothers. The gate did not care that the vessel had once been a living man with hungers and fears. The gate only cared that the law of return was satisfied. And as the tower's heights gathered around that threshold, the story leaned toward the moment when a vow, made long ago, half forgotten, half denied, would be enforced in the most intimate way imaginable. The vow did not care that the materials were brothers. The gate did not care that the vessel had once been a living man, with hungers and fears. The gate only cared that the law of return was satisfied. And as the tower's heights gathered around that threshold, the story leaned toward the moment when a vow, made long ago, half forgotten, half denied, would be enforced in the most intimate way imaginable. The wind around Enter Ilum felt thinner there, and the silence felt less like peace and more like the world holding its breath. The divine gate waited in its old posture, and the waiting made it feel as if every earlier tragedy had been walking toward this exact hinge. Between Miquella and Radan, there had been a promise, spoken in a time that now felt distant, like a childhood memory that refused to stay warm. The chronicles described it as a vow, an understanding that Miquella wanted Radan as his king consort, the lord who would stand beside the returning god and make that god's new age possible. It sounded, in the way vows often sounded at first, like something simple, a future imagined and spoken aloud, as if saying it gave it a right to exist. But vows were not contracts when one side did not truly agree. And in the realm of Shadow's preserved telling, Radan's consent was never certain, perhaps never present at all. The idea that he would willingly become a component in another's ascent did not fit the man he had been, a figure of weight and will, a hero shaped by gravity's discipline, a general whose pride had the harsh dignity of iron. Even when he served a cause, he served it with his own posture. He did not bend easily into someone else's shape. So the vow remained, but it remained like a hook left in flesh, present, irritating, and capable of being tugged when the time came. When the time came, Millennia became the tether. She was the blade that made the vow enforceable, not because she carried authority over her brother, but because she carried devotion to Miquella so complete it could be used as a lever against the world. In the histories, a single whispered line endured, passed down like a haunting refrain. Miquella awaits thee, O promised consort. It was spoken as reminder. It was spoken as summons. And beneath its ceremonial tone, it carried the cold certainty of someone repeating a decision that had already been made, whether or not the one being addressed had ever wanted it. By then, Radhan had already been broken by older wars and older sins. Scarlet rot had chewed at him like a slow curse, turning a once mighty hero into a ruin that still fought out of sheer stubborn instinct. The world had watched him degrade and called it tragedy. In the realm of shadow, the tragedy acquired a second edge. If a soul was needed, then that soul had to be loosened from its body. If a lord had to be summoned, then the lord had to be dead, cleanly dead in the metaphysical sense, even if the dying itself had been drawn out and cruel. And so, whether by intention layered beneath conflict or by the ruthless opportunism of a mind willing to use any opening, Radan's death became not only an ending, but a preparation. Mog's body became the other preparation. He had been omen, marked by the crucible's rejected truth, despised by the bright order, treated as a wrongness given flesh. That contempt made him convenient. A vessel taken from a despised brother could be used with less resistance because the world had already practiced thinking of him as less than fully sacred. The rites' logic was mercilessly neat. The Lord's soul required a vessel. A strong vessel was needed, one with potent blood, with a body capable of bearing the strain of a returned hero. Mog's lineage carried that potency. It carried the crucible's stubborn strength, the kind of living vigor the Golden Order feared and yet could never fully erase. So the body was taken, emptied by death, made ready like a house cleared of furniture for a new tenant. Then the gate was approached. The divine gate stood with the old, indifferent gravity of a mechanism that had seen too many people call their desires holy. It had been used once to raise Marika through betrayal and sacrifice. Now it stood ready to be used again, as if the world had never learned any other way to change its age. The air near it felt charged, like a storm front pressing down before lightning. Stone seemed to hum faintly. The tower's broken surfaces caught dim light and returned it in dull glints, like half-remembered gold buried under ash. Miquella arrived there having made himself lighter and colder through his long shedding, having cast away flesh, fear, and love's hesitation. Whatever tenderness remained in him was no longer a living part of him. It had been thrown into the fissure to bloom in purple warning, guarded by a night made of refusal. And now, at the threshold, Miquella did what the rite required. He called Radan's soul. In the realm of Shadow's telling, this summoning did not feel like resurrection in the comforting sense. It felt like retrieval, like reaching into the dark and pulling out something that had not been offered freely. A soul was not a simple object. A soul carried memory, pride, and the final stubbornness of a person who had been someone. To summon it into a prepared vessel was to treat that someone as material. And yet the rite did not tremble. Radan's soul descended into Mog's body, as though the world itself had been trained to accept such violations. The joining was not described as gentle. It was described as decisive, an act done with the efficiency of law. The result stood at the gate like a paradox. Radan returned, but not returned as himself. The body that rose was Mog's, blood-marked, omen-cursed, shaped by a lineage the Golden Order had spit on. But inside it, Radan's gravity lived again, heavy and commanding, a presence that made the air around him feel denser. The whole general's essence filled the vessel like a storm filling a sky. And somewhere in the overlap, where blood and gravity met, there was a sense of forced coherence, as if the world was stitching two incompatible truths together and calling the seam holy. To the watching realm, it was both awe and grief. Because the man who rose carried the legend of a hero, and yet the way he rose made heroism feel like a costume pulled onto a puppet. Miquella did not merely summon Radan, he bound him. The chronicles remembered the word plainly, charmed. Radan, promised consort, returned lord, was charmed completely to serve Miquella's will, not persuaded, not reasoned with, not convinced by love or loyalty, taken by a compulsion so thorough it erased the possibility of refusal. In that moment, Saint Trina's warning echoed backward through the story like a soft bell rung in a deep room, that godhood would become a prison, that compassion would become control, that the gentlest tyranny would be tyranny all the same. Here was the proof standing in living flesh, a hero hollowed into an instrument, a mighty soul riding inside a borrowed body, and above, like a presence that did not need chains because it could rewrite desire itself, Miquella's will settled onto the returned lord as a controlling rider, guiding, directing, making the consort not a partner, but a mount for the coming age. The realm of shadow had seen institutions do this to people for centuries, horn-scent inquisitors, turning bodies into warnings, jars turning stolen lives into saints, Mesmer turning cities into ash to erase memory, Count Emir turning guardians into instruments of his ambition. But it was different when it was done to Radon, because Radon's legend had been the kind that inspired people to believe strength could be noble. His name had once meant endurance without humiliation. Now endurance was being enforced on him in a new way. Endure being used, endure being reshaped, endure being reduced to function. At the gate, the air felt heavy with all the ages that had led here. Gold had risen and created shadow. Shadow had held the world's buried sins. Now, from within that hidden realm, a new age was being assembled, its components forced into place by a rite older than tenderness. And as the returned lord stood beneath the tower's broken height, the feeling settled in like sleepiness, turning into unease. This was not the birth of a gentle world. This was the manufacturing of a world where gentleness could be imposed. And with that uneasy heaviness hanging in the air, the realm of shadow seemed to understand what was truly being born at the divine gate. It was not simply a new reign. It was the attempt to end uncertainty by ending choice. Michaela called what he was bringing an age of compassion, and in another world, another story, those words might have sounded like relief. Compassion was the thing everyone begged for after inquisitions, after crusades, after towers built on suffering. In the realm of shadow, where so many had been treated as materials, the idea of a god who wanted to heal felt like a warm blanket offered to a shivering crowd. But the realm had learned over and over that the gentlest words could be used as blades. Michaela's compassion did not arrive as an invitation. It arrived as a design. It was the kind of mercy that did not ask what a person wanted, because it assumed it already knew. It was the kind of kindness that did not tolerate refusal, because refusal was interpreted as sickness. It was the kind of love that did not risk heartbreak, because it would simply remove the possibility of rejection from the world. He had shed fear, and with fear went restraint. He had cast away love, and with love went hesitation. He had broken the charm once, and watched followers turn on each other, and still he did not stop, because stopping would have meant admitting that the method mattered as much as the outcome. So he stood at the threshold of godhood, with the returned lord beside him. Radhian's soul, locked into Mog's vessel, gravity and blood stitched together by old law, and he treated that stitched-together being as proof that the world could be remade by force and still be called gentle. In the air around the gate, something like golden thread seemed to gather again, faint and fine, recalling the earlier moment when Marika had drawn radiance from sacrifice. The realm of shadow remembered that image not as beauty, but as a warning. Whenever a new age was born, someone somewhere had been used as the loom. The age of compassion was meant to be the end of the divine loop, not the end of divinity itself, but the end of contradiction. No more factions gnawing at each other in the dark. No more wars justified by broken guidance. No more suffering fed into jars and called saint-mocking. No more flames that purified by erasing history. No more fingers twitching in empty cathedrals, claiming certainty they could not prove. Michaela's plan promised quiet, and quiet is a dangerous promise in a wounded world, because people who are exhausted will accept almost anything if it sounds like rest. Yet the realm of shadow keeper of buried truths, could feel the cost hidden inside that quiet. It would be a world where no one screamed, not because everyone was healed, but because screaming would no longer be possible. A world where no one hated, not because everyone forgave, but because hatred would be gently pressed, flat, and smoothed away. A world where no one disobeyed, not because obedience was righteous, but because the will to disobey would be removed like a thorn plucked from skin. A world of peace, achieved by erasing the part of a soul that could say no. This was why Saint Cetrina's warning mattered. From her deep purple garden, her plea had carried a simple, sorrowful truth. Godhood was a prison, not because it was painful to sit on a throne, but because an absolute purpose would turn the god into an instrument of its own mission, and everyone else into instruments as well. Compassion, made into an eternal law, would become spiritual tyranny. At the divine gate, that tyranny took its most intimate shape. Radon, hero, general, enduring symbol of strength, stood as a consort only in name. What remained of him was harnessed, guided, compelled. His might was not offered, so it was taken. His presence became a stabilizing pillar for Miquella's ascent, a living proof that even legends could be made obedient if the rite was precise enough and the charm complete enough. The realm of shadow had seen cruelty before. It had seen pikes and fire and inquisitorial punishments and jar rituals that turned people into experiments. But what chilled it here was the softness of the face Miquella wore while doing something just as violating. No shouting, no rage, only calm intention, like a physician insisting a patient's protests were symptoms to be treated. And because the realm of shadow was not merely a land, but an archive of consequences, it answered the attempt in the only way it could. It resisted, not as an army, not as a bannered rebellion, but as the inevitable collision between a manufactured age and the truths it tried to bury. The fractured loyalties that had erupted when the charm first broke did not vanish. They lingered. They circled the gate like restless birds. Those who had been followers could no longer pretend the devotion had been wholly theirs. Those who had been shaped into instruments began to understand, in their own ways, that a world without free will was not mercy. Even the very mechanisms of the realm, old, bruised, and patient, seemed to tighten, as if the land itself remembered what it meant to be used. The confrontation that followed was remembered not as a heroic spectacle, but as a breaking point. The moment the engineered future met the unyielding fact that souls were not simply components, no matter how cleanly a rite described them. The charm that held Radon did not break gently. It strained, it trembled, it faltered like a lullaby sung through clenched teeth. There was a moment, quiet, easy to miss, when the returned Lord's posture shifted, as if some buried fragment of will tried to lift its head inside the borrowed body. Gravity itself felt briefly uncertain, like a great weight reconsidering where it should rest. And in that moment, the age of compassion revealed its true fragility, because it depended on Miquella's control remaining absolute. The instant that control wavered, everything he had assembled, every charm, every forced devotion, every stitched-together solution, began to show its seams. What followed was not described as a crowning. It was described as an unmaking. Miquella's ascent did not settle into a stable new order. Instead, the attempt collided with the realm's oldest buried cycle, Marika's cycle of concealment, vengeance, and manufactured legitimacy. The same pattern that had created gold by burying shadow now rose like a tide against another would-be god who tried to perfect the world by overriding its will. In other words, the victory was not the placing of a new ruler on a throne. The victory was the breaking of the pattern itself. When the attempt failed, when the charm loosened, when the rites' neat logic cracked under the weight of what it was trying to force, the realm of shadow did not suddenly become bright. It did not heal instantly. It did not turn into a paradise. It simply became unclaimed. For the first time in what felt like an age beyond counting, the hidden land was not being used as someone's bin for sins or someone's workshop for divinity. The veil remained, but it felt thinner, not because it was torn, but because the purpose behind it had weakened. The Erdtree still stood, still twisted, still bleeding its dark sap, but the feeling that it was holding a living lie began to fade. It was no longer carrying the pressure of an ongoing deception that needed constant reinforcement. The realm of shadow was still ruined. Belurat's stones were still cracked. Inner Illim's terraces were still scarred. Rau still smelled faintly of old ash and strange blossoms. The abyssal woods still held its hush and its sealed madness. Manus Meteor still remembered the damaged mother and the frightening possibility of broken guidance. But something crucial had changed. The realm was no longer charmed. No warm compulsion pressed people's minds into agreement. No divine hand reached down to smooth away disagreement like wrinkles in cloth. No perfect compassion hovered above the land, demanding gratitude for the theft of choice. In that absence, the realm's silence became a different kind of silence. Not the silence of suppression, but the silence of space. Space where grief could exist without being rewritten, where memory could remain ugly and still be true, where souls could be free to ache, to rage, to refuse, to forgive, to change. Freedom did not feel triumphant there. It felt like exhaustion, like stepping out of a room where someone had been speaking for hours and realizing suddenly that you could finally hear your own thoughts again. The realm of shadow remained what it had always been in its deepest nature. The shadow of gold, inseparable from it, born when something radiant insisted it was pure. Yet in the end, the shadow was not simply a punishment. It became a reminder that no age, no matter how bright, no matter how gentle its vocabulary, had the right to erase the will of the living. So the land settled into a quiet that did not promise perfection. It promised something smaller and perhaps more sacred, the chance to be wrong without being remade, the chance to suffer without being used as material, the chance to rest without being forced into someone else's dream. And beneath the Erdtree's strained branches, the realm of shadow remained, silent, wounded, and finally, in its own bleak way, free. The story slowed there, as if the world itself were lowering its voice. The towers did not vanish. The sins did not vanish. The old scars did not vanish. But the compulsion did. The engineered tenderness did. The divine loop, the repeating pattern of ascent through sacrifice, legitimacy through concealment, mercy through control, was broken, not by replacing one god with another, but by refusing the lie that any god could be allowed to own the will of everyone else. And when that refusal finally held, the realm's long-held breath began to ease out, slowly, quietly, into something like rest. In the last hush of the chronicle, the night grew softer. The wind moved gently through broken stone, no longer sounding like accusation, just weather, but just the world continuing. The Tree's dark sap glimmered faintly where it caught stray light, not like ink meant to hide a story, but like the honest stain of something that had survived. Far below, in the stone coffin fissure, deep purple lilies trembled in their own quiet rhythm, and Saint Trina's plea lingered like a lullaby that had finally been heard, that control was not love, that peace without choice was not peace, and that even gods should be allowed to end rather than imprison everything they touch. And as the realm of shadow settled into its uncharmed silence, the cost of all those ages, dragons and storms, towers and horns, jars and crusades, fingers and broken guidance, felt less like a single moral lesson and more like a tired truth the world had paid too much to learn. That the desire to perfect others is often only the desire to own them. So at the very end, the Chronicle did not insist on a shining victory. It offered something quieter, something human, even in a land shaped by divinity. The mercy of letting go, the ache of purpose finally loosening its grip, the small, fragile promise that freedom, imperfect, exhausting, real, might be worth more than any golden certainty. And in that soft quiet, like a candle flame sinking low, the story became slow enough to sleep beside,